Here we go. Um, so yeah, now that that's going, welcome again, to the North American cohort. And I joined Tuesday morning for the reflection, and it sounded like people were really enjoying the experience so far and had learned a lot about trying to maintain hope and inspire action and just really loving the fact that there was community built into this experience. So I was really happy to see that and hoping that today we can kind of continue on that path. Um, so my name is Gina Fiorelli Duranlo, and I am facilitating today along with my colleague Alicia Christensen. Like I said, we're North America cohort, so we are kind of from all over a little bit. We have educators from the Great Plains, Northwest, Alaska, Southeast, Hawaii, and international folks as well. So Alicia and I are excited to be here. Um, Facilitating this particular cohort. And this is us. Alicia is, she just gave a wave, but we both work for CERES, which is a environmental science research institute at University of Colorado Boulder. It's a NOAA funded institute. Um, and it stands for the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, which is a big mouthful. In our particular team, we work in education and outreach. We just actually were named a Center for Engagement, Education, and Evaluation, so CEEE. It's a lot of acronyms, which I apologize about, but hopefully we're having everything written out here. Um, and then even more specific than that, a project that Alicia and I both work on is called Clean. I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with it, but I will be giving a little bit of an overview on it later today. Clean is the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network. So we are a a project focused specifically on providing classroom resources and tools for teachers, um, and supporting professional development and professional learning. So we live within the the environmental science community and at the university, but our project is really specific to climate education. So CERES itself is based in Boulder, Colorado, which are the traditional lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute. And I actually work remotely from the East Coast, so I'm on East Coast time. Feel free to check out our social media handles, um, Clean Network, Clean Net, and then the CERES Education Outreach is our broader team. And I mentioned the traditional lands that CERES is based on, and just want to take a moment to acknowledge, oops, sorry, um, do a land acknowledgement for all the other spaces that we are um, existing on today. We take time to acknowledge the native land we are on because it's easy to forget that we are occupying it. Due to colonization and genocide, lives of Indigenous individuals and communities are sometimes hidden. So it's important to do these acknowledgements and bring it up to our immediate attention. But we know that they are alive and leading change in our world. We recognize the tremendous resilience and innovative climate solutions that are created by these communities, the Indigenous communities, and seek to promote their ideas and histories and current work in climate education. Um, so one really cool tool is this nativeland.ca. And I don't know, Alicia, if you can, oops, yeah, I can't copy it, but maybe you could share it in the chat, Alicia. Um, and what this is a really cool tool. If you open up the link, it will show you a map of the world. And you can zero in on the location that you're in, and it will tell you and show you on a map what native land you were on. So why don't we just take a minute to open up that link? And yeah, maybe some of you already know what native territory you uh, reside on, and feel free to put that in the chat. But if folks want to take a second to just look around on that map, it's again a really interesting resource. Um, and share in the chat where you're calling in from today. Thanks everyone for sharing. And if anyone has any questions about this resource, we can talk about it a little bit more, but feel free to continue adding in the chat if you'd like, if you feel comfortable. Lenny Lenape, thank you, iPhone, for sharing that. And yeah, it's just something really important to be mindful of. So we, I know over the past couple of days, this has been asked of you a few times, and it is really, really helpful. So if you could rename yourself on Zoom so that we know who you are. I see a few default names, iPhone and that kind of a thing in our Zoom room, and it's just really helpful for both security purposes and to just communication wise to know who's in here with us. You can rename um, by going into your settings on Zoom. And I know we've all been on Zoom a lot, so if you're not familiar, unmute and start video button. You can view all the participants by clicking on the participants button. And then you have the raise hand and reactions feature by clicking on the reactions um, button there. And if anyone wants to turn on closed captioning, you are free to do that as well.
And let me just answer a question in the chat real quick. If you
Okay.
click on the three buttons at the top of to the top right of your picture, that should give you the opportunity. If you go all the way down that list, you'll see rename on there.
Thanks, Alicia. Great. Yeah, Alicia, while we're doing this introduction, is helping me monitor the chat. So do feel free to put any questions in there. It's hard for me to see and read at the same time. So continue calling out any questions you might have. And thanks everyone for continuing to put your native land acknowledgement in there as well. It's just really interesting to see and hear about different tribes. So, one other thing I just wanted to call our attention to is these guiding principles of our interactions at the Institute. So, we just want to acknowledge that sometimes conversations can be difficult. We're all coming from different perspectives and backgrounds, and just be really intentional about how we're interacting with each other. Um, it's important when we're having discussions to listen and not be always super critical, but to listen to understand and maybe step back if you feel like you're taking up a lot of the space in our group. Everyone's voice matters, and we're all learning and have something to contribute. We need to be open and listen to understand, like I said, and paying attention to who's talking and who's not. Like I said, if you feel like you can step back at times if you're contributing a lot, that's fine. But also maybe challenge yourself to speak up if you're on the quieter side. I am, and I know that I really have to challenge myself to do that sometimes. Um, Using I statements is really helpful as well. That way you're not making assumptions about how other people feel. Um, Lean into vulnerabilities. And then at the end of the day, we want to have fun and be creative. And what we put into today is what we're going to get out of it. Okay, excuse me. So, what we're going to do next is a little introduction activity. Um, and sorry, Alicia, again, if you could put into the chat the link to the Jamboard. We are using Jamboard again before it phases out, and oops, sorry about that. Alicia's going to put in a link to a Jamboard. If you've never used this tool before, it's a beloved tool amongst my team. Um, and it's really easy to use. Unfortunately, they are sunsetting the tool in October, but we're going to take advantage of it now. Um, there is a menu over here with tools that you can use. So when you open up the Jamboard, you'll see this blank screen with a prompt at the top. What is a recent memory about your community that made you smile? And what do you love about your community are the two prompts. Um, Feel free to take a sticky note like we have here. It says summer pool time. It'll just pop up with a sticky note. Um, or you can draw. There's this little pen feature. If you are trying to draw water, you can take a hand at that, add an image. Someone here put living near the lake and a photo of the lake. Text box if you want to just type something out, circle if you want to highlight something, and then there's also an erase option if you want to maybe fix some of the drawing. So everyone feel free to enter into that Jamboard and start sharing one of your answer to one of these prompts if you're comfortable. And I will do the same.
Real quick, it looks like we're needing to request access.
Ah, let's see. That's always the issue, isn't it? Anyone with a link can edit. That's what we want.
think I just updated that. You should be able to edit it now.
Let's see. Folks are able to start joining.
I'm still seeming to not be able to get in.
That's what I did. Um, has everyone tried the link that I shared in the chat? The new link? Or are we still working off of? Oh,
Yeah, it's still not working.
It seems to be working for me now. Is anyone
okay.
else getting into?
Maybe the refresh helped. Okay. Yep. So, okay. So it sounds like if you click on the new link and my refreshing helped. Sorry about that. issue. It's always seems to be that I'm confident that a link is going to work and then it doesn't. Um, thank you.
It's strange too. I went in and changed the permission and saved it and shared the link and then had to go in again and change the permissions again. So I don't know what's going on with it, but
Yeah.
I mean, that's tech for you, isn't it?
Yeah.
yeah, so it sounds like people are having luck if they refresh their screens for those that it's still not working for.
I don't know if this people have how familiar people are with Jamboard, but if you want if you're feeling a little bit cramped with space, you can also hit this arrow and click next frame, and there's a whole new blank screen that you can add your photo to. So, and there's an unlimited number that we can do that with. So, um, if you want a little bit more space, please feel free to do that. Okay, we'll give it just another minute, and then we'll start going over this and transitioning into our next agenda item.
Wonderful to see uh, all the uh, things that have made you all smile within your communities this summer.
For sure. So yeah, I'm seeing some really awesome photos, family hiking and biking, building connections with students and working on our campus, um, compost workshop at community garden. So it sounds like one really big theme for people is community and building connections with others. some outdoor time, morning walk, having all the kids outside together, people watching, it sounds like a little bit, which is really fun. Um, Plants and growing things. Oh, that's an awesome photo. Wow.
There's also space on the next page too. Running out of space.
Friends and family nearby. That is an awesome photo.
How do you get to the next page?
If
You
you
just
look
hit,
at the top, there are two screens and there's an arrow that you
right.
can
All
just
right.
scroll over
Okay.
to the right.
Uh-huh.
And then we've got some music, people out and enjoying nature. Um, so yeah, we have some time built in today as well to do that a little bit, which is fantastic for a virtual event. But to get outside and move around, we've got a couple of breaks and activities if you choose to do that. So I'm glad to see that that's a central theme for all of us. Um, and yeah, thanks everyone for sharing. Um, let's just take a look now at our agenda for the day. Um, oops, excuse my error right there. So we're wrapping up introductions right now, and I saw Matt Burgess just actually entered the room. So we're excited to have him here and have his presentation uh, to continue our morning. Then we'll have a little 15-minute break after that. Then we'll move into another presentation by our colleague Jessica Bean, who does some really fantastic work on understanding global change. And then Alicia will be leading a discussion and field experience activity. I just mentioned if you want to get outside, we will give you the option to do that. We'll have an hour break for lunch. Um, and then we will do more debriefing and discussion. I'll give a little overview of CLEAN, the project I was mentioning before that Alicia and I work on. We'll move into the afternoon with environmental and social justice presentation and another break. Then we will do our last presentation of the day, which will actually be a film screening talking about mental health and climate change. And then we'll close out and end between 4 and 4:30 Mountain Time. And yeah, Alicia just put the link to the agenda in the chat. Thank you, Alicia, for doing that. But so you can see all of this information in that link, and then as well below that, the session descriptions and bios for our presenters. Um, and also Alicia and my email are right here, so feel free to email us if you want anything, but chat is probably a quicker way to get a good response. So yeah, that is our agenda for today. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Um, and is Matt? Yeah, there's Matt. Hey, Matt.
Hey everybody, how's it going?
We're doing good.
I'm very good.
Um,
Excited to hear you talk this morning.
Sweet.
yeah, so I'll just give a little introduction. Um, and I think Matt, you should have the ability to share your screen, but um, let me know if you don't.
Let's give it a shot. Looks like I can do it.
Awesome. Thank you. So Matt, who's joining us today, he's an assistant professor in Department of Environmental Studies, faculty affiliate in the Department of Economics, and a fellow at Ceres, who Alicia and I are affiliated with. Um, he is a faculty fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's a director of Center for Social and Environmental Futures and a CU faculty fellow for higher education and democracy. Starting in August, very soon, he will be moving on to be assistant professor of economics and a presidential fellow at the University of Wyoming. And so Matt will be sharing with us some content and knowledge about mitigating and adapting to climate change on a society-wide level. Um,
Is the connection okay?
my computer screen just completely went blank for a second. I'm gonna just let you go ahead in case something weird is happening.
Cool, yeah, no
Thanks,
worries. Thanks
Matt.
so much. Yeah, so as Gina said, I'm an assistant professor at CU, direct the Center for Social and Environmental Futures, and with mixed emotions, I'm moving on soon. So I put both my emails up here. I'm not sure if Colorado's going to turn it off in August. So the new one's already active, so either of these works. And yeah, I want to talk about climate change polarization, which has become both a major research focus of mine and I would say really a passion, inside and outside the academy. So I want to talk a little bit about why it's become a passion and a research focus, why I'm motivated. Some key facts about US political polarization that I find often surprise people, but are helpful for understanding climate change polarization. Some key facts about climate change polarization, that some of which I find also surprise people, both sides of the aisle. I'll talk a little bit about some of our key findings on climate change polarization and opportunities for bipartisanship that they, I think, reveal. And then I'm going to talk about what my research and other research and polls suggest to me, at least, is what a big tent approach to climate change would look like. And I think there's a lot of implicit advice in it for how to reach people if you're looking to reach across the aisle, if you're looking to reach students from different backgrounds, if you're, depending on which part of the country you're in or part of the world you're in. Often we have people from Canada. Is there anyone from Canada here? I can't see everybody's hands. There are. Okay, cool. Hi, Tegan. I'm from Canada too. I grew up in Brossard, Quebec. Okay. So why did I get interested in this? Interestingly, it's not so much my training. It's not like I went to grad school and focused on polarization or politics or psychology. My background's a mixture of economics and ecology. But I really got interested in this because I felt like the conversation in the halls of the departments that I was in, environmental science, ecology, environmental econ, all had the flavor of we need to change all of society over decades, and only 1/3 of the Democratic Party can be trusted to do anything about it and has any good ideas. Like, that doesn't even make sense. Like, even if it's true that they have good ideas, where's the theory of change there? And I've come to believe that we basically have three options. If we're really serious that we need to change all of society over decades to get off carbon, our three choices are we can do it together, we can not do it, or we can do it and undo it every 4 years, or we can wreck democracy and hope that the dictator is a climate hawk. Now, two comments on that. One is that economists have actually studied this, and it turns out dictators tend not to be climate hawks. They tend to have less environmental stewardship records than democracies do, perhaps not surprisingly. But the second reason I mention this is I'm not completely joking. There really are serious people who say in public forums that maybe we should wreck democracy to go faster on climate change. So I would argue don't take for democracy for granted for environmental reasons and for many, 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 many other reasons. Okay, some key facts about US political polarization. And by the way, I'm not going to show data on Canada, but it's mostly similar. The English-speaking world is separates itself from the rest of the rich world in terms of how climate polarization manifests, with a little bit more extreme polarization in the US. I sometimes like to joke, with apologies to the Americans in the room, that many of America's greatest strengths and greatest weaknesses can be traceable to the fact that it was founded by the most adventurous and puritanical British people. Maybe only half joking about that. Okay, so back to the main event. So political polarization is now the most severe form of affective polarization by far. Psychologists, when they say affective polarization, what they mean basically is how much do we prefer in-group to our out-group and how much do we dislike our out-group. And so there are many measures of this. This is one of them, where you basically ask people, on a scale of 0, I hate them, to 100, I love them, what do you think about various groups? And then you compare how highly they rate their own group versus some out-group. and the difference measures some degree of in-group out-group polarization. This is just one measure. It's not perfect, but there are many other measures that in this case all show the same thing, which is that on the top, these are two different measures of party. So higher on the y-axis is more polarization. Democrats and Republicans have become more polarized over time, while other types of polarization, thankfully, have gone down. So this is, there's my mouse. This is racial polarization for white and black Americans, way down. Religious polarization, Catholics and Protestants. Nobody today thinks it's a big deal that Biden is a Catholic, but when John Kennedy was elected president, it was a big deal that he was a Catholic. And so thankfully, our racial and religious polarization has reduced. Okay, if you look at the present day wings, the people on the edges of the political spectrum, on both sides, they're disproportionately rich, white, and educated. I think a lot of people in rooms like this tend to not be surprised that this is true about the far right, but I sometimes find people are surprised to learn this is true about the far left. Sorry, I have seasonal allergies here. Okay, so both sides are rich, white, and educated. Why does that make sense? My intuition for that is, well, first of all, historically, it's not surprising. So political revolutions tend to be driven by elites fighting each other, not the masses fighting elites, even though the elites fighting each other often adopt language of the masses. And secondly, the intuition for it maybe is, if you're disadvantaged, if you're living on the margins, politics affects your day-to-day life and sometimes your subsistence in visceral ways, right? You're not going to want to experiment with getting rid of the police if you live in an area with high crime, for example. But if you're relatively advantaged and relatively isolated from these things, then politics can become a hobby. And in fact, the wings are also more likely to have politics as part of their identity. And I think of it as like a shirt. If politics is a shirt to you, then you want to make sure that your shirt is brighter and more interesting and more colorful and more attention-getting than everybody else's shirt, because that's the way you gain status. And you don't have to pay the price often for the naive ideas you put forward. And if anything, purity is good if politics is a shirt, if it's a way to gain status in online and elsewhere. Okay, the second thing about the wings that I think is important for understanding today's polarization is the right wing has 2 to 3 times as many people in it as the left wing. So this is a survey called Hidden Tribes by the group More in Common. And basically what they do is they ask people their opinions on a whole bunch of different issues, and they try to cluster them. They see, what are there groups of people that tend to have similar opinions across different issues. So in this case, they divided it into 7 clusters. And then they ask, are there groups of people that separate themselves from everybody else on a number of issues? And that's what they call the wings. So, these two groups together are what they call the right wing or the conservative wing. And then this is the progressive wing. And the progressive wing is 8% of the country. That is not enough people to win most primaries, right? So, for example, whether or not you agree with this, a good example of left-wing weakness in primaries is recently Jamal Bowman lost a primary in the Bronx to a 70-year-old white guy who called him a racist, right? That wouldn't have happened 4 years ago. It's harder to find analogs of that on the Republican side in primaries because the Republican conservative base has much more people in it. So it's a lot harder to get past them in the GOP primary. And then lastly, the other thing that tends to surprise people is that the median voter is socially right-leaning and economically left-leaning, and isn't a college grad. A lot of people in higher education settings tend to think that the median voter is over here, is the economic conservative, social progressive. That's a disproportionately elite position, but it's also a disproportionately unpopular one. Again, if you want to think about it intuitively, if you are who is the median voter, statistically speaking, it's a suburban Christian working class person without a college degree. Is that person going to be a social conservative or an economic conservative? And are they going to be a social progressive or an economic progressive? Okay, because there are more people in the right wing than in the left wing, the right wing has more power in the Republican Party than the left wing has in the Democratic Party. And the result of that, or one result of that, is that this is a measure of how much Republicans have moved to the right versus Democrats have moved to the left. In the 70s to today, and you can see that the Republicans have moved to the right in their voting more than the Democrats have moved to the left. And again, I would argue that's probably a primary effect, or it's an effect of the fact that conservatives are a majority. Conservatives are a majority of Republicans. Conservatives and moderates together are actually a majority of Democrats, which might surprise some. Okay, the left wing's power is primarily in culture. So there's not very many progressive activists, but they've become completely dominant in the last 10 years in higher ed, in big tech, except recently for Twitter, in HR departments, in Hollywood, right? And so they can make a lot of noise. And so that there's this pattern in the last 10 years that some sociologists call the Great Awakening. This is two measures of it, but there's many others where basically progressive activist cultural positions have become hugely more represented in media and academia and these other spaces, starting around the kind of early to mid 2010s. Arguably, Trump's election in 2016 was partly a backlash to that, although of course the extremes feed in each other, and so Trump's election hardly put a stop to it, and vice versa. But again, because the left wing doesn't have a lot of people in it, their positions are actually pretty unpopular. So one of my favorite examples of this is when in 2021, sick of the defund the police crowd, Seattle elected a Republican DA. Which again, imagine like the opposite of that is hard to imagine, right? Imagine like rural Georgia electing a Democrat congressperson, right? Okay, despite our polarization, I think a final thing that surprises people is there's actually a lot of agreement on a lot of issues. So in 2020, arguably at the height of American political polarization of the last generation, a really good student of mine named Renee Marshall and I we wrote an op-ed where we basically tried to figure out if you had to make a presidential platform that consisted only of policies with 2/3 or more majority support, could you do anything? And if so, what could you do? And the answer we found is that you can actually do a lot. And so here are some examples. You could have a $15 federal minimum wage. That's probably higher today because of inflation. I think McDonald's in Boulder pays $19 an hour. I saw that at a drive-through once and called my assistant and was like, give our interns a raise because we're not paying them less than McDonald's. You do more infrastructure spending. Even some of the issues we think of as the hottest, there's actually a lot of agreement. So huge majorities of people believe in banning chokeholds and having background checks for guns. But most people don't want to get rid of the Second Amendment, much to my chagrin as a Canadian. And most people don't want to cut police funding. Even in the height of 2020, 80% of the American Black community wanted the same amount of funding or more in their communities. And then immigration. Who could think of a more divisive issue than immigration? Even that, over 2/3 support more merit-based immigration, more secure borders, but also permanent status for the Dreamers, for the DACA recipients. I don't have abortion on here because in 2020 it wasn't as hot of an issue as it is now, but I believe there's 2/3 support or nearly 2/3 support for legal first trimester abortions and illegal third trimester abortions, which again, not to be a smug Canadian, is the approach of most of the other Western world. And then the other one I mentioned because it's also been related to a controversial Supreme Court decision. Whereas the Dobbs decision is unpopular among the public, the affirmative action students for fair admissions decision is very popular among the public. 3/4, including majorities of Democrats, majority of every major racial group, does not like race in admissions or hiring. Okay, climate change polarization. So there is a extremely impressive, wonderful Boulder resident retiree named Claudine Schneider, who I've gotten to know over the last few years, who in the 1980s was a Republican congresswoman from Rhode Island and led bipartisan climate legislation that was sponsored by both Al Gore and Newt Gingrich, right? If you can believe that. And And why was she able to do that? She was able to do that because in the late 1980s, everybody agreed that climate change was a concern. The fraction of Democrats, Republicans, and independents that were worried about climate change was basically identical among the public. And then, of course, the gap widened with Democrats becoming more concerned, Republicans becoming less concerned, Americans as a whole kind of bouncing around, but in the last 10 years becoming a little bit more concerned. We see that concern about climate change tends to dip a little bit temporarily after some major other event that distracts the public or focuses their attention, right? So it dips a little bit after 9/11, it dips a little bit after the Great Recession, and it dips ever so slightly. It's hard to see after COVID-19. Part of it, like why did this happen? Part of it is the Merchants of Doubt story. There's no question that there were industry-funded groups that spread misinformation that contributed to this. But part of it is a basic political economic story. So that on the right here, this is showing let me just minimize the screen thing here. Sorry. On the right, this is showing who prioritizes environmental protection over economic growth. Again, it kind of dips for everybody during the 90s. People started to realize that back then when the technology is immature, some of the big solutions to climate change were quite expensive. That's changed recently. Also, if you look at where polarization is greatest on climate change, among rich countries, it tends to be in English-speaking developed countries. And this great paper by Smith and Mayer argues that this probably has at least something to do with English-speaking conservatism having more of a libertarian streak than conservatism, say, in other places, right? If you think about like Marine Le Pen or Giorgia Meloni, they're not libertarians, in the same way that some American conservatives are. Okay, but there's some signs that this polarization is abating in some important ways. So this is more recent data. Basically, if you break Republicans and Democrats into liberal and moderate versus conservative Republicans and conservative, moderate, or liberal Democrats, then you actually see the real divide that's emerged since about 2015 is not between Democrats and Republicans, it's between conservative Republicans and everybody else. And that has, I think, important political effects that you're starting to see. Similar to what I showed with general policies, if you look at what are some positions, can you find climate positions that huge majorities agree on? You actually can. So general positions, US should participate in international efforts like the Paris Accord. Most moderate Republicans agree with that. Again, there's a split between them and the conservative Republicans. Taking steps to be carbon neutral, about 2/3 of Americans agree with that, carbon neutrality by 2050, again with a split between moderate and conservative Republicans. And there's lots of individual policies that have overwhelming support and some that are more divisive, right? So if you require most new buildings to be run on electricity with no gas lines, then you really do lose most Republicans. Same thing if you're requiring all power plants to eliminate all carbon emissions by 2030, you do lose most Republicans. And then there's also a tribalism effect. So moderate Republicans support a lot of climate policies, but when you ask them, do you like Biden's climate policies? Now you really do see a strong Democrat-Republican split with moderate Republicans saying they don't like Biden's climate policies. And I would argue some of that has to do with the policies themselves, but a lot of that has to do with the just the tribal aspect of it. And the same thing happens on the other side. There was a study by my colleague here, Leif Van Boven, that found that Democrat support for carbon tax policy goes down by about half if they think Republicans proposed it versus Democrats proposing the same policy. Okay, here's, I think, a really interesting graph. Okay, and again, it goes back to the fact that when you've got moderate Republicans in the fold with independents and Democrats, you have strong majorities. So this is what fraction of Americans by congressional district think Congress should do more to address global warming. And orange is more than 50% and green is less than 50%. The thing I want to draw your attention to is two districts. This one here, that's Lauren Boebert's district. I think it's something like 57% think Congress should do more to address global warming. Her new district, CD4, is still more than 50%. And then this one up here is Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, again, more than 50%. So even some of the deepest red districts in the country, represented by some of the most conservative Republicans, there's still majority support for Congress doing more to address global warming. As a result of this, we did a study that found that climate change opinion may be becoming an election issue for Republicans. So this is just raw data from this voter study group that has individual opinions for about 4,500 voters on a whole huge range of issues and their demographics. And what you see, if you weight by population, so you have a representative data. The width of these bars is what fraction of the population you're talking about. And so the fraction of Americans that think climate change is somewhat or very important is about 2/3. This is one poll, but there are many others that show the same thing. It's about a 2-to-1. Climate change is important and we should do something about it. It's about a 2-to-1 majority opinion. And among those that have this opinion, there's about 75% of them in 2020 voted for Biden. And these the fraction of Americans that think we should do something is getting larger over time, and the fraction that prefer the Democrats among that subgroup was also getting larger between 2016 and 2020. Now, that doesn't mean that all Democratic positions on climate are popular and all Republican positions are unpopular, but I think it does mean that denial of climate change, which was President Trump's position in 2016 and 2020, is less popular than the kind of standard Democrat position. And we tried to estimate what effect that might have had on the 2020 election. Long story short, it's really hard to estimate that precisely. There's no perfect statistical way to tease out climate from everything else it's correlated with. But our answer was that it might have been a strong enough effect to change the outcome, all else equal, in favor of Biden because it was such a close election. And I'll also say, Republicans are starting to pay attention to this. I know that many top Republicans have seen this study. If you look at, for example, even recently, President Trump's talking points for the debate that he released around climate change, what he said in the debate about climate change, what for the most part, if not entirely, people have been saying at the RNC, they've at least to my eye moved clearly away from it's not an issue and more what do we do? Not necessarily, obviously, still different from what the Democrats want to do, but at least not denying the issue. There's been a lot of bipartisan cooperation at the state level. So Renee Marshall, the same amazing student that I had who was working on this, she looked at, for her honors thesis, every decarbonization bill passed between 2015 and 2020 at the state level in every state. And she was looking at, how many were bipartisan and what were the characteristics of the ones that were bipartisan. And she found that about 1/3 of them were bipartisan. That's the purple ones. About 30% were passed by Republican-controlled state governments. There's even this small fraction that was passed by only Republicans and Republicans governments. And the ones that were bipartisan tended to do three things. They tended to expand choice, so use carrots rather than sticks. They tended to use financial incentives, and they tended to avoid racially divisive social justice elements. So if they had elements to address inequality, they tended to frame them in terms of class as opposed to in terms of race or gender. There have also been some federal developments. There's bipartisan solution caucuses in the House and Senate, which talk about climate. John Curtis, who's a congressman now running for Senate in Utah, Republican, in 2021 started the Conservative Climate Caucus, basically a climate caucus of Republicans, and now it includes about 1/3 of the House GOP. I think there's more than 80 members of it now that are all sitting Congress people who are Republicans who care about climate change. Climate spending was in the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure and COVID relief bills, and the CHIPS and Science Act has a lot of climate spending. That was also bipartisan. Even the Inflation Reduction Act, which was not bipartisan, that was passed along party lines. My hypothesis is that it will survive, even if the Republicans sweep the election, for a couple of reasons. One, the elements of the IRA, for the most part, expand choice, use financial incentives, and frame inequality in terms of class. And so they're actually the element there. You can find elements similar to the IRA that Republicans have passed at the state level. That's number one. Number two, most of the spending in the IRA is going to red congressional districts. I think partly that was intentional to make the support more bipartisan. Partly it has to do with where do you build renewable energy? You tend to build it in red places. So, the congressional district with the second most planned and operational renewable capacity is represented in Congress by Kevin McCarthy, who formerly was the speaker. And so for that reason, there's been a lot of reporting that some of the more hardline climate stances that you read about in Project 2025 or that former President Trump has espoused, although again he's recently softened his rhetoric a little bit in my perception on climate change. Some of those ideas don't have the popularity among House and Senate Republicans to make it into law. And one thing, for example, that a lot of climate scientists are worried about is big cuts to climate science in NOAA. I think that's a good example of this in the last Trump administration. The most, if not all, of the White House budget requests that came out when Trump was president did include big cuts for federal climate science funding, and the Congress always reversed it and actually ended up increasing climate science funding in each of the budgets that were passed during the Trump administration. And I won't go into specifics, but I know for a fact from conversations I've had behind the scenes that there were some Republicans, including some Republicans from Colorado, who were quite central to that happening, to preventing big cuts to science. And again, in Colorado, that makes perfect sense. Climate science and science in general, and federal science in particular, is a huge contributor to our economy. So it totally makes sense that people from both sides of the aisle, politicians, understand that. Okay, another study we did was we looked at what happens to popularity when you pair climate policies with non-climate policies. And we based all of the ones in our experiment on real examples that were either passed or proposed. And so U.S. adults who were selected to be nationally representative on race, sex, age, and ideology either saw climate policies alone, so they saw these four and they were asked to rate how much they supported each of them, or they saw these four each paired with one of reducing regulations, so pausing new EPA regulations, which is based on the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act that was a bipartisan carbon tax bill that died in committee in 2021, where the idea was we're gonna bring Republicans on board by combining a carbon tax with pausing new EPA regulations, particularly on CO2. Combining with infrastructure, right? That's the IRA, the Infrastructure Investment and Job Acts is like that. And then two different versions of environmental justice. And we split them out, again, because the median voter is economically progressive and socially conservative. And so our hypothesis was that voters would react differently to policies that were economically progressive but identity neutral, and policies that were not identity neutral or had social justice jargon. So use words like equity and marginalized that people associate with sociology departments, that whatever you think of sociology departments, by large numbers, independents and Republicans don't trust them in the last 10 years. Okay, what we found is a story that I would summarize as negativity bias. So if you added pausing regulations to climate to try to bring in conservatives, you didn't move conservatives, but you moved moderates and liberals against it. So they supported less than they supported climate alone. And same thing for social justice. If you tried to please liberals with social justice policies, you didn't really move the liberals, but you lost some moderates and conservatives. And so there were significant negative effects on popularity overall of both of these. And then if you paired climate with things that are broadly popular, like economic redistribution, and with infrastructure, basically nobody moves and there's no difference. The one caveat to that is that there's a small increase in support for liberals without a decrease in conservative for economic redistribution. In our study, it was not statistically significant. There was one other study that just looked at this pairing and did find a statistically significant positive effect on popularity driven by liberals. So maybe this one works, but our overall conclusion was that pairing more often than not reduces support. And again, it has to do with what psychologists call negativity bias. That if you who wants to vote for a candidate that's going to both open the borders and ban abortion, right? My guess would be nobody would vote for that candidate because people oppose things they don't like more strongly than they support things they like. Another study that I don't have time to get into where we saw the same thing, or a negativity bias, is we looked recently to see has Elon Musk's conservative persona increased conservative support for electric vehicles? And what we found is that not only hasn't he increased conservative support for electric vehicles and Teslas, he's reduced liberal support for Teslas. So again, it's an example of liberals who don't like his new persona moving more than conservatives who do. And that's a challenge if you're trying to build a big coalition around any issue, is that the more you try to kind of piecemeal add issues and positions and policies to bring more people into the fold, the more you risk losing even more other people. Okay, so what does a Big Ten approach to climate look like? As I mentioned before, our studies suggest that carrots over sticks is part of it. Focusing on class and kitchen table issues rather than identity. Again, we see that in both of our studies. And by the way, I would add for carrots over sticks, also focusing on positive economic messages as opposed to negative ones, even independent of what the actual policy is, right? The economics of renewables and carbon capture are and nuclear to an extent, and minerals, are becoming so good that we would help ourselves by framing climate change as an economic opportunity as opposed to a cost we have to pay for the good of everybody else. Okay, what else do I think is a part of a Big Ten approach to climate change? Optimism over pessimism, plain spoken discourse over hyperbole and histrionics. I'll go over to examples of each of these. National pride over national shame, and peaceful civic actions, not throwing soup or harassing commuters. Okay, so let's go through each of these. Optimism over pessimism. As somebody who's naturally an optimist, I wish it was the case that research found overwhelmingly that pessimism never works. Unfortunately for me, that isn't the case. That pessimism can be motivating, but what it does tend to motivate, I would argue, is more performative catharsis. It motivates people to post on social media, for example, some studies have found, and it actually can be demotivating because of fatalism and depression in terms of concrete actions. So there's some good research on this that's summarized by Madalena Vlasianu and Jay Van Bavel in Scientific American recently, and they and others have done some good work on this. Okay, secondly, even if it wasn't the case that optimism motivates more concrete building type actions than pessimism, I would argue that the youth mental health crisis is a big cost to pessimism, and I think this is relevant for teachers, right? If you're teaching doom and gloom about climate, you are probably making this worse, and I'll show some data on this in a second. And so even if you thought that doom and gloom was motivating, you should weigh it against this. And then lastly, optimism is unifying, pessimism is divisive. And I would argue that optimism is more consistent with the facts. So let's get into a couple of these things. Youth mental health is a crisis. So self-reported mental health challenges have gone way up, but so have emergency room visits for self-inflicted injuries, especially among young women. It's not just that people are more aware of mental health and more willing to get help. That's true too. Those things are good, but it's also that mental health has gotten worse in tangible ways. There's one study that found 4 in 10 young people are afraid to have children due to the climate crisis. There have been some critiques of the methods. Whether or not it's 4 in 10, I don't know, but I can certainly tell you as someone who's taught undergrads for the last 6 years that it's definitely a noticeable fraction of young people that are that climate fears are viscerally affecting their day-to-day lives in ways that are not good for their mental health. The mental health crisis, if you break it out by age and gender and politics, is disproportionately a phenomenon of liberals, and particularly young liberals, and particularly young female liberals. So Pew asked in 2020, as a doctor or healthcare provider ever told you have a mental health condition? More than half of 18 to 29 politically liberal women said yes. Now, is that, this is before Dobbs, that certainly there are things that politically liberal women, have the right to be angry about. But it's not disproportionately women of color. I believe it's disproportionately white women. It's not disproportionately poor and working class women. I think it's disproportionately upper class. And so, it's disproportionately very liberals who are disproportionately rich, white, and educated. And so many people have argued recently that there may be something to do with the messaging in the progressive movement these days that's contributing to this. It disproportionately, compared to 10 to 15 years ago, catastrophizes. It disproportionately emphasizes lack of agency. If something's going wrong, the climate's going to get us, or there's some system that we have no control over that's going to get us. Both things that are not good for mental health. Okay, optimism is consistent with the facts. So, to state the obvious, climate change is real. Some impacts of climate change are accelerating over time and will accelerate as we get warmer. But nonetheless, the deaths from natural disasters as a fraction of the population have gone way down since the Dust Bowl and over past decades. Damages as a percentage of exposed GDP have gone way down too. So this is different types of natural disasters, different radii from the national disaster. So are you looking 50 kilometers from the national disaster or 400 kilometers? And this is the damages done by year as a percentage of exposed GDP, globally in black, in poorer countries in green, and richer countries in blue. Two things I want to draw your attention to. All the lines go down. So damage rates from disasters are decreasing everywhere on average. And they're decreasing more in poor countries on average than they are in rich countries. Now, why does that make sense? I think this is an adaptation story. Again, it's not that climate change isn't real. It's that so far our ability to adapt has been outrunning it in terms of these types of impacts. And adaptation, there's lots of evidence that it's correlated with GDP per capita, and GDP per capita is growing faster in low, middle, and middle income countries than in high income countries. And so the one caveat to this story is we should be concerned about the very poorest countries that aren't growing and are, for example, seeing increases in hunger, like in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which climate change plays a role in. But overall, the world is getting better. And the idea that climate change, existentially threatens the future of Boulder undergrads, in my opinion, is wildly detached from the facts. If you look at where we're headed, the current policies and actions, so we do what we're doing now and nothing else. The various studies, this is just one of them, but there's several, project that gets us 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming if we just do what we're doing now and nothing else for the rest of the century. If we hit our 2030 targets and then stop, about 2.5. If we keep our promises, about 2. If we keep our promises and get lucky, 1.8. If we do 1.5, then 1.5. The point of all this is we're off track from 1.5. We might get close to 2 if we're diligent and keep making progress building on where we are. But we are very far off of trajectories that get us to 4 and 5 degrees of warming by 2100. And I mentioned that because the majority of impact studies cited by the IPCC use this scenario, which is the 4 and 5 degree scenario. And this is just showing, where we're headed under current, stated policies and promises in terms of emissions versus this scenario. And we're wildly off track. And what do you think gets disproportionately picked up in the media? It's narratives based, narratives that sound sensationalist, that sound doomist. It's going to be disproportionately these ones that use these hot scenarios. These are the fraction of mentions of each scenarios in the 2 impacts chapters of the last 2 IPCC reports. And again, by far the most common one is this scenario or its predecessor. So be careful what you read. If you read a catastrophic climate headline in the New York Times, click through to the paper that it's based on, see if that paper's result is based on this scenario, RCP 8.5, or the newer one, SSP 5 8.5. And if it is, take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. Okay. The world has also just been getting better dramatically over the last 100 years by a bunch of different measures. So in 1820, basically everybody was poor by today's standards. Slavery was legal literally everywhere in the world in 1820. very few people were educated. There was little literacy. Democracy as a fraction of the population basically didn't exist. Vaccines, we didn't even know what germs were, right? Child mortality has gone way down. And again, and not equally, not everywhere, but often, especially recently, like the last 30 to 40 years, disproportionately in poor countries. So child mortality, for example, has declined by 2/3 in low-income countries since 1990. Not a lot of people know that. Okay, plain spoken discourse over hyperbole and histrionics. I would summarize this as common sense. People recognize when they are not being treated with respect. And so people can see through hyperbole pretty easily. So one of my favorite examples of this was from John Podesta, who founded the Center for American Progress and worked in the Obama administration. And there was a week or two where it looked like Joe Manchin might kill the Inflation Reduction Act. And Podesta said to the New York Times, "It seems odd that Manchin would choose as his legacy to be the one man who single-handedly doomed humanity." Now, the IRA passing or not is definitely not the difference between humanity living or dying, right? Even though, for the record, I think it's a good bill and I'm happy it passed. The U.S. emissions are something like 13% of global emissions, and depending on if we build any transition lines, the IRA's effect on American emissions, varies between 40% and close to nothing, right? If we can't improve permitting according to modeling studies I've seen. So, that fraction of 13% does not the world apocalypse make. And so if you talk like this in ways that are obviously not serious, people aren't going to take you seriously. And worse, some teenagers will take you seriously and become depressed, which you should all be worried about. And then also people are engaged when you meet them where they are. I had a conversation recently. I was invited to give a talk like this by a local progressive climate advocacy group. And one of the people in the Q&A asked me, how do I combat fossil fuel misinformation in my community? And my response was, well, what are they saying to your community? And the gist of what they were saying to their community was that U.S. natural gas is relatively clean and has historically contributed to reductions in American emissions. And my response was, well, both of those things are true, regardless of who said it and why they said it. So if you want to convince people that overriding climate considerations mean we should leave Colorado's natural gas in the ground, you can make that case, but you have to make it. You can't just wave it away and expect people to take you seriously. And that's even more so when there's visceral economic concerns, right? So I've talked to, for example, conservatives in Western Colorado who talk about how they wish they could develop their shale gas more, which is one of the largest, shale basins in the world. And the people who won't let them, the voters who don't want them to, they say are voters who are disproportionately richer than they are in the Front Range, Boulder, Denver, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, and they would be richer. Their community, which is relatively poor, would be richer if they were allowed to develop their shale. Again, that's also true. And there still may be arguments why we should not develop their shale. But the way you're going to bring those communities along is by having respectful, honest conversations that take their concerns seriously. If I, a professor from Boulder, went out to Grand Junction and said, "Oh, you just want to develop your shale because fossil fuel misinformation told you to," I would have lost that room instantly. And I would argue rightly so. Besides being if we catastrophize it, that could also be dangerous. So, for example, in the 60s, there was a famous book called The Population Bomb that incited fears that overpopulation was going to, make Britain cease to exist by the year 2000 and cause millions to starve in India, I think were two examples. And it scared the heck out of people. And partly in response to that book and a similar one by the Club of Rome, the Chinese government instituted the one-child policy, which led to about 100 million forced abortions. There were a bunch of other eugenic policies passed in other countries for the same reason. So that was, a humanitarian catastrophe. And obviously the population bomb's predictions didn't come true. In Sri Lanka, the president at the time in 2021, who was a, good Berkeley educated guy, to many people's non-surprise, caused a hunger and economic crisis in his country and had to reverse course. It's not hard to imagine what somebody might do, a dictator might do, if they actually thought that, getting off of fossil fuels, say by 2030, was, a world-ending necessity, right? Imagine China gets 60% of its energy from coal. What would happen to Chinese poverty if we turned that off overnight? And yet, if you ask, your students if they want to do that, I would bet that a lot of you, most of them would say yes, not understanding what it means. In academia, at least, and possibly also K-12, we're extremely concerned about anything that could be dangerous, right? There's even in the last 10 years been people talking about how speech can be violent, except the one thing that we are not, I think, afraid of enough is communism and more broadly, simplistic tribal narratives. Communism is probably the deadliest thing humans have ever done to each other, killed almost 100 million people, much more deadly than other things that we tend to think of as the deadliest things in the 20th century. And again, the tragedy of communism is that it starts from often real important observations about society. For example, in China, there's too much inequality. We'd like to catch up in terms of industrialization to Britain. But then simplistic, naive, tribal narratives take over that oversimplify complex problems, and you end up with tyranny and mass death. So listen to Hannah Ritchie, a young, she's the head of the environment group at Our World in Data, and she has this great book called Not the End of the World, and this Wired article that says, stop telling kids they'll die from climate change. We need our kids to, we certainly need our kids to care about the issue and make their voices heard, but we also need them to roll up their sleeves, and learn skills to do something about it. I sometimes jokingly ask my students in my class, raise your hand if you think that the rate limiting step in the energy transition is that there aren't enough 20-year-olds holding signs. Most people laugh and few people say yes, because we also need people to, learn how to decarbonize cement, etc. Okay, so carrots over sticks, focus on class, kitchen table issues rather than identity. By the way, if you have material-focused, race-neutral approaches to reducing inequality, but inequality happens to correlate with race, which we know that it does in the US and most other countries, class-based approaches will also reduce racial inequality. Optimism or pessimism, plain-spoken discourse over hyperbole and histrionics, national pride over national shame, and peaceful civic actions, not throwing soup or harassing commuters. I can't remember if I have this slide, but there's been some recent studies that, again, not to my surprise, find that peaceful civic actions move people towards your cause. Throwing soup and harassing commuters piss people off. There were similar studies that found, for example, in the 60s, the racial justice protests that were violent turned people off and may have helped Nixon get elected in 1968, and the peaceful ones moved people towards the cause. So national pride over national shame. This is something that I'm working to test more formally, or will be in my new job. But it's I think a pretty strong hypothesis that comes from the fact that there's lots of evidence over decades of research in economics and political science that investment in shared identity predicts public goods provisioning. So if people feel like they, share an identity with other people in their country, and the identity doesn't have to be ethnic or national. In fact, one of the beauties of America and Canada is that we're nations of immigrants, right? We are able more easily than most countries to have identities that revolve around our ideals and our diversity as opposed to our ethnicities. But we need to have some kind of shared identity, or the research suggests we tend to not trust the government, we tend to not trust each other, and we tend to not provide public goods, which require both of those things. We trust in government and trust in each other. Or more simply, common sense dictates that we invest in groups we are invested in. We need a heck of a lot of investment to address climate change. And so if I'm right that basically having a strong shared identity and being proud to be American or Canadian is important to creating the political will to do a big nation building project, which probably we need to do to address climate change, my guess is that's probably a blind spot for many current climate activists, because right now, how worried you are about global warming negatively correlates with how proud you are to be American. I haven't seen the data for Canada, but I would be shocked if they weren't the same. And so again, if you want to build a coalition for climate, think about the consequences might be of painting, unalloyed negative portraits of your country. So key takeaways: we need to work together to address climate change. I would argue that opportunities to work together on climate exist, and we've seen them. Maybe not going fast enough, but we've seen increasing bipartisanship at the federal level, at the state level, and the economics are getting better and better and better for renewables and other climate solutions. The electoral incentives are getting better and better and better for at least acknowledging the issue and proposing something for it. And so I'm optimistic that the future is going to hold more collaboration on this issue than the past. I think we have a good idea of what a big tent roadmap looks like: carrots over sticks, class and kitchen table issues, road and identity, optimism or pessimism, plain spoken discourse, national pride or national shame. And then the other thing I'll add is that there's evidence in psychology that if you have two groups that are in conflict, say conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, if they can find a way to collaborate on something that they share, so infrastructure, in the past, but climate in the future, that actually, evidence suggests, lowers the temperature in general. So if we can make climate our moonshot as a society, in a bipartisan way, that might actually lower the temperature across the board, especially if, the more we find that doing so is good for our economy. Some advice for having better conversations about anything. I won't go through all these. I think most of them are common sense. But if you're going to disagree with something, start by stating the strongest version of the thing you're disagreeing with, as opposed to setting up straw mans. Distinguish objectives. What do we want from strategies and constraints? The last two are objective, right? So if we say, should we care more about the economy or immigration or abortion, that's a normative question. Reasonable people can have intractable disagreements on that. But if we say, we want to boost the economy, should we raise or lower taxes? At any given time, only one of those two answers is right. And so if we can isolate what the strategies are and the constraints are from the objectives, then we can focus our objective scientific thinking, more squarely on the objective questions. Engage in slow thinking. People have an automatic fast brain, and that's where stereotypes and other kinds of things come from. Where if we think slowly and carefully, we're less likely to be biased. We're more likely to be humble. Intellectual humility. If you think you know everything, then you can prove with Bayesian mathematics that the value of information to you is zero. So I always say to my students, if you think you know everything, you're literally wasting your money. If you think that we should take up a policy, this again goes back to some of the extreme naive stuff. Explain how you think it would work. So, for example, defund the police. If you want to get rid of the police or abolish the police, I know that abolish and defund are different from each other. If you want to abolish the police, explain, okay, who are you going to call when somebody breaks into your house? I think that kind of thought maybe pulls you away from the extreme versions of that. And similar thing for right-wing examples. Be kind. If you think that humanity is good, you're going to be less tribal, you're going to be less polarized. Treat people with respect, which I would argue involves avoiding both giving and taking unnecessary offenses. And remember that hearing ideas and teach your students this, there's lots of evidence that humans are intellectually, emotionally, and physically anti-fragile, which means that we need stress to be strong and to thrive. And so surrounding yourself with people that you disagree with makes you stronger, makes you smarter, makes you more emotionally give you higher emotional fortitude, not less. So parting thoughts to what I like to say to conservative friends is, what could make America greater than leading the clean energy economy? Are we not the leader in innovation? If we innovate first to address climate change, do we not get to export that at huge profit to everybody else? To liberal friends, if climate change is really an emergency, which many liberals say it is, then you should be willing to work with anybody and make compromises to solve it. You're not going to, ask your heart surgeon what his politics are before he or she operates on you, because it's an emergency. And so the same should be the case about climate change. And then to everyone, I would say we face a major challenge with climate change, but we live in one of the greatest societies by almost any measure that has ever existed. If you look at America's biggest flaws, you find them everywhere else in world history and time and space, and they're almost always worse than they are here now. If you look at America's biggest strengths and Canada's, you find them almost nowhere else in world history and time and space. And so while we certainly should acknowledge and improve on our flaws, the thing that's interesting intellectually, scientifically, is our strengths. And so let's focus on those. Let's act like we believe in ourselves. And that's what's going to help us get it done on climate. Thank you.
Yay. Thanks, Matt.
And
Awesome.
I haven't had a chance to look at the chat, but I'll look at it now.
The chat was pretty active. We did have one, I would say, like substantial question. So Erica's just, I think she was maybe musing a little bit. She said, how much would these perspectives change if we switch climate change with terms like sea level rise or droughts, depending on the location? For instance, Louisiana legislators agree that sea level rise is an issue, but don't support climate change solutions.
Yeah, that's definitely true to a point. I mean, again, even when you phrase as climate change, you have 60% to 70% support, right, for a lot of the basic stuff. But yeah, it's certainly true, you know, that climate adaptation in particular has a lot of different names. It's also true that I think even more for the politicians than the voters, right? If you're a Republican, being too hawkish on climate change might be a loser in the primary, again, because conservative Republicans are the ones that kind of separate themselves in that issue, but they are a majority of Republican primary voters. But, you know, not taking the issue seriously is a loser in general. So there is an incentive to kind of not talk about it in the primaries, right? An example of a politician who I think practices this is Ron DeSantis, right? If you look at how Ron DeSantis is governed as governor of Florida, he's made record investments in seawalls and mangrove restoration. He's made huge investments in the conservation corridor. He blocked drilling in the Everglades. He clearly understands what climate change is and how it affects Florida, right? But you're not going to see him, you know, on the stump when he's running for president in the Republican primary talking about climate change. And there are other examples that I've read about, you know, like Louisiana with coastal, wetland erosion and other places that are prone to climate threats. And then there's a lot of issues like, is it people, you know, using different words and not talk about climate, or is it people tackling an issue square on that has some climate and non-climate causes? I think you could phrase it either way. So, for example, in Colorado, or you can think of it either way. In Colorado, their water scarcity is a big issue and wildfires are a big issue. Climate change is gradually making both of those things worse, but there are other things that contribute it, right? So bad water management can make water scarcity worse. Conflicts with other states, right, that we share water with. And same thing with fires. You know, part of the reason we have a lot of wildfires is the historical, not allowing prescribed burns in the U.S. Specific fires. We had a horrible fire, you know, near where I live a couple of years ago called the Marshall Fire, right, that burned about 1,000 homes down. And again, you know, did climate change contribute to conditions, you know, for a wildfire in December being more likely? Absolutely, it did. But also, you know, there was a cult compound running a garbage fire that maybe they shouldn't have been doing. There's a power line that came down. There was a natural gas leak. I believe the authorities still don't know which of those or what combination of those caused the fire. You know, so the point is that there's a lot of bipartisan cooperation in the West on water scarcity and wildfire. And I think some people could say that that's a climate issue that we're choosing for political reasons to not always call a climate issue. I think other people would say it's a climate and these 5 other things issue. Let's just talk about wildfire. Yeah, it's a good question and a good point.
Thanks, Matt. I just wanted to call out, we had one other question come up too. And we're approaching break time, but I wonder if we can address this really quickly. How and what are the fiscal responsibilities being performed for climate change solutions off course or of course by government?
Can you, oh, yeah,
Yeah,
Syra, can you clarify the
yeah.
question? Because there are a couple different ways I could imagine that going.
Hello, everybody. This is Saira Hanafidi from Pakistan. Thank you for delivering the very well versed presentation. Actually, by fiscal responsibilities, I'm focusing more on the fiscal policy. When we talk about the income and expenditure policy, and specifically, I just want to know about the taxation. Is there any kind of tax exemptions or tax refund, something from the fiscal point of view, what the government is doing for the climate change solutions?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question that obviously varies by state, varies by country,
In
varies
terms
by
of
administration.
expenditures, in terms of
Yeah.
income, and in terms of taxation.
So
Yes.
let me answer. I'll answer it at a high level. I mean, fiscal policy. People are talking about government spending, government taxes. How much deficit or surplus you're in. Usually deficit, right? And so there's two ways climate enters that. So one is you spend money to address climate, right? And either you pay for that with tax increases, or you increase the deficit. And some people worry about that. There's is the Inflation Reduction Act inflationary or not? Was the IIJ inflationary? That's a debate. And then, of course, the other side of it is if climate change messes up your infrastructure, you have to spend a lot of government money to fix it, and that's also a fiscal problem, right? And so there are fiscal responsibility arguments both for kind of short-term caution on how much money you're spending on climate, and also for making sure you address climate and avoid having to pay big damages down the road in terms of your infrastructure. It's true that we subsidize energy in general. We now subsidize renewable and fossil. I think one of the things, probably a lot of people who think about climate know sort of the arguments against doing that. One of the arguments for doing that is cheap energy is a huge positive externality that's felt throughout the economy. So if energy prices go up, prices of everything basically go up. And so anyway, there are arguments on both sides. I would say, regardless of how best to strike the balance in a particular context, certainly efficiency should be a priority regardless, right? So for example, if the IRA spending isn't going to do what it's supposed to do without faster permitting, then we should have faster permitting, right? As kind of one example. If climate change, if climate variability, like even if we got off emissions today, right? We got our emissions to zero today, we would still have some impact with climate change, as the historical emissions receded. So we should be smartly adapting to climate change regardless of what our mitigation strategy is. And that certainly includes fortifying infrastructure against climate, which again, as I showed you earlier, history suggests we've been better than we think at that in terms of having, a good example in the US is like how much less damaging Irma was in New Orleans compared to Katrina, two hurricanes. Irma wasn't that much weaker than Katrina, but New Orleans learned a lot. Emily, do you have a question?
Yeah, real quick, it just kind of occurred to me when you were showing us those graphs of the model projections, saying like, well, actually, like the worst case scenario is not what we're projecting because of policies and pledges that have been made. I've gotten pushback from students sometimes who say like, oh yeah, that's really nice, but we don't trust the government to actually do those pledges or do those policies, so whatever. So what would you say to those students?
Yeah, well, I would say that it isn't just the reason we're not in the high scenario isn't just pledges and policies, right? So for us to actually get, I'm going to pull this slide again. don't just need to not do new policies. We need to turn off every climate policy we've ever had. We need to undo a bunch of the economic gains in the cost of solar and wind and natural gas. And we need to have basically a coal bonanza that, again, even a no policy world supports. We also need to have so much economic growth to have enough energy demand with the coal bonanza to get this hot that sub-Saharan Africa would have a GDP per capita suggest, of over 100K today's American dollars a year. So basically everyone in the world is kind of a Google employee or richer, and we're all in on coal. And we have to be completely unconcerned about climate change, which, if we actually got this hot, would make large parts of the tropics almost unlivable to humans 300 days a year. So basically, to believe that scenario, you have to believe that we're going to have super rich sub-Saharan Africans who are having a coal bonanza, and nobody in the world cares about climate change for the entire century. That just doesn't make any sense, right? It's just like the problems with that scenario are not subtle, and so it's not like we elect not anti-climate candidates for 10 years and, oh my God, 4 degrees is back in play, right? It's just not. It's people who are using these scenarios don't understand the socioeconomic assumptions that they make, basically.
Thanks, Matt. And sorry again, my camera for some reason is not working and my internet is unstable, of course. So I apologize for not being on camera. And yes, thank you again, Matt, for being here. One final thing is folks were asking if they could get your slides. So I'm wondering if you
Sure,
would be
yeah.
open to sharing that with me. Okay,
100%.
great.
Yeah, I'll share it after. And then, as we've done in the last 2 years, I'd love if everyone doesn't mind, I'd love to post the video on
Yeah.
my website afterwards.
Yes, absolutely. I have the recording going right now. Thank you so, so much, Matt. I really appreciate it. And Matt provided his email, so feel free to reach out if you have additional questions. But at this point, I want to give some time for break and respect Matt's time. And we will be back here at 12:45 Eastern, 10:45 Mountain Time.
Awesome. Thanks so much,
Matt.
everybody. Enjoy your day, and good luck with teaching. It's God's work.
It truly is.
Yeah. Take care,
Thanks,
everybody.
Matt. Thank you. Hey, Jessica, do you want to test out any tech or anything, or are you feeling good?
That would be great. Let me get my slides going. Sorry.
Question, is there a different link for the next session?
Nope, this is it all day.
Oh, okay. So it's just one link today.
Yep. Yep,
Awesome.
exactly.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
How does that look?
That looks good. Oh, yep. That looks perfect.
Okay. And then if I switch over to the slides, okay, cool. I can move it around a bit.
Yeah, the bottom is slightly cut off, but not terribly.
It's like I think the whole slide is in view. It's just the stickies are actually off the slide because these are like
okay.
stickies that people can move around.
They can move. Okay.
Yeah.
That looks good then.
Okay. Cool. Should I just leave it up or should I stop share? What would be best?
No, probably just leave it up and then we can go right into it. I'll read a little bit from your bio to introduce you and then I'll pass it over to you and we've got an hour set aside, so I don't know if you are speaking the full hour or are gonna take questions at the end, but that's kind of the timeline.
Sure, I'll try to make it. Oh, there's some interactive stuff that's similar to other webinars that I've done with you.
Right.
So, yeah, so hopefully I won't be talking at everyone the whole time is the goal.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fair. I know I spoke for 30 minutes this morning. I felt like I was talking at everyone. So um, I'm sure the interactive pieces will be well received.
Sounds good.
Thank you. All right. It is showing 12:45 on my clock, so gonna get us started back in here. All right. So folks, probably coming back to their computers at this point, and I'm gonna try to keep us on schedule. So next on our agenda, we have an hour with Jessica Bean on exploring the Earth system with understanding global change. Um, Jessica Bean is the leader of the Understanding Global Change project at the Museum of Paleontology at UC Berkeley. So she's joining us from the West Coast. She designs tools for learning about the Earth as a dynamic, interconnected system. She studies the effects of environmental change along the California coast, has taught college and graduate level biology and earth science courses, and partners with K-12 educators to develop and implement new tools for learning about the nature of science and climate change. So, in her time here with us today, she will be talking a little bit about causes and consequences of and solutions to climate change and how complex those things can be. Her main focus of today will be talking about developing systems thinking and how that can help learners to explain how the world is changing, why these changes are causes for concern, and the cause and effect relationships among things that may seem disparate parts of the Earth system. We're going to deepen our thinking about climate change phenomena through the exploration of the Understanding Global Change framework, which Jessica's going to share with us, and engage in construction of Earth system models. And a note that these tools have been integrated into various instructional resources, including the NCSE climate change lessons, and we will explore how you can use them in planning and implementing your classroom. So, Jessica's got her slides up here already, and we've got about an hour with her. And please please stay with us because this is going to be a really fun interactive session. So thanks, Jessica, for being here.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks so much for having me. And it's great to be here with all of you and the opportunity to share these resources, which, as Gina mentioned, are being used to support climate change curriculum across the country, especially in K-12. But I also work with undergrad and graduate students as well in community colleges and at UC Berkeley. So again, great to be sharing these resources with you. Thanks for having me. Just a couple of notes about me. So I'm a scientist by training. I have a PhD. It says geology, but my work really lives at the interface of paleontology and marine biology, and ocean chemistry is a lot of what I've studied to really understand climate change and how environments have changed through time, looking at patterns and chemical signals, especially in shells of marine invertebrates, like these mollusks here. This is actually a new species that I described from San Diego, California. And this is a picture of a bryozoan, which is a colonial organism. They look a lot like corals, but they're not corals. They're actually pretty distantly related in the tree of life. But they can tell us a lot about ocean acidification and how our oceans are changing and changes in conditions and coastal environments. But throughout my career, even starting as a graduate student in my first year, I was designing courses for undergraduates, which I absolutely loved. And I started teaching earth science for future teachers. And that led me to an amazing career where I get to do both. I get to work as a scientist, but I also spend a lot of my time in education supporting young people and their teachers, really engaging with local environments and using this understanding global change tools as ways of showing what they're thinking and modeling and thinking about the world and sharing what they know. So again, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. So today I'll give you a little overview of understanding global change, or you'll hear me say UGC a lot, and just where this project came from. Like, why did we create this project? There are a lot of other resources out there, and we didn't want to create something that wasn't going to be useful or add to, again, the rich resources that already exist in the world. I'm going to introduce to you the UGC framework and the resources. And I'm going to give you a quick tour of the website as well. Also, just so you know, all of these slides will be available to you. I'll be sending them to Gina and she'll be able to post them and make them available to you. So don't worry about frantically scribbling everything down. But I'll be sending these to you. And then hopefully if we have time, we'll play a game called Earth System Shuffle. I'm not sure if we will, but either way, I will explain how the game works. And maybe it's something you could try out in your classroom or with your students soon. Okay, so the way that I like to start off thinking about why we developed the Understanding Global Change tools is really thinking about how we talk about climate change and global change. And you'll hear me use the phrase global change, which of course encompasses climate change. But we did develop our resource with an eye towards really trying to combine all of what we mean by both climate and also ecosystem change, and how all of those things are, of course, interrelated and connected to each other. So again, I'm going to probably end up using the phrase global change a lot, but again, just know that what I mean is that also that again encompasses climate change, that climate change is a part of global change. And the reason why was we wanted to take a really holistic approach to thinking about how the world changes through time and why it changes, climate change being a big part of that. So there's some questions that I really like to ask in the way that we think about global change and climate change. And that is how, of course, is climate change or global change connected to our daily lives, the changes that we experience in ecosystems and in our climate. So I'm sure you have a million of ideas by now, in this series of workshops that you're engaging in. But let's just put some ideas in the chat. How are changes in Earth's ecosystems and climate connected to our daily lives? So Gina's saying our food systems, most certainly. Does anyone want to expand on what do we mean by food systems, or how are other things connected to food systems? Our ability to irrigate affects our health and our economic activity. Yeah, let's unpack those. Any other ideas that are coming to mind, again, that you've been thinking about, even in the last talk that you were just in? I heard a lot of ideas. All the food we eat, the weather patterns, how we adjust to those weather patterns. Yep. So species diversity locally and globally, natural hazards such as flooding. Yep. So I heard a lot of talk about infrastructure at the end of the last talk that I caught. Anything else that we want to add that we're thinking about? How is this connected to our daily lives? Diseases, yeah, how diseases are changing and moving. I work with a group that's studying Lyme disease and how Lyme disease is expanding as ticks move across our country, right? Lots of people relocating, yeah, so people moving. Yeah, unfortunately, I come from a community where we've been devastated by multiple large wildfires, and people have had to relocate due to loss of their homes, including my own parents. So I can relate to that. Yeah, anything else that we're thinking about right now? How is it connected to our daily lives? All right, so let's ask the next question. What do we teach in our courses that is not in any way relevant or connected to climate change or changes in Earth's ecosystems? So can we think of things that are not in any way related to changes in Earth's ecosystems and climate that we teach? Not seeing anything in the chat yet. I see an yeah. Is there anything we can think of? So yeah, so again, we came up pretty quickly with a long list of ways in which our daily lives are connected, right? But what is it that we actually teach, or what is it that we want our students to think about that is not in any way connected? And the reality is that it's hard to think of anything, as Gina's saying. And so then the question that I really asked myself when we were starting this project is, okay, so given our responses to these first two questions, does this align with how we teach about Earth's ecosystems and climate change? So about real changes that are happening in our world. And I'm wondering what you think of that, given what we just shared, that there are so many things connected related to climate change to our daily lives, and there really are very few things that we teach that are not connected. Does this align with how we teach? And I see one response so far, not really. That was my feeling too, was that we're not, given that this is so big picture and holistic and requires us to make so many connections, is that really how we're teaching climate change? Any other responses to that question, that last question on the screen? I see a +1 for the not really. Yeah, so again, the work that I started doing was really thinking about like, well, how do we make those connections explicit and how do we make that thinking visible to students and have students have a way of sharing how they are seeing the world and learning about the world so that we can talk about those connections and that students can really be able to see how so pretty much everything we teach, right, is in some way touched by climate change. Everything we care about, everything we think about, right, is related to what climate change is doing to our ecosystems and our environments. And as was said earlier, like our human systems, our society, our economics, right, that all of these are touched by climate change in one way or another. Um, And yes, they need to love the earth. I'm seeing a comment about that younger students need to love the earth before anything else. And yes, I totally agree. And I think part of loving that world is understanding the complexity of how everything is so interconnected and related to each other, to really understand that. And yeah, so really, really excited. And yeah, and I'm seeing a comment about focusing on environmental systems. And yeah, so how do you connect environmental systems? And I love working with teachers who are like ready to jump into those big ideas. So here we go. So as part of the Understanding Global Change project, we developed a conceptual framework to help organize the complexity of climate and ecosystem change topics. Because obviously when we started making that list of how are all these things connected to climate change, right? That's a big list. There are a lot of moving pieces if we're talking about climate change and ecosystem change and all of what that means. So how do we bring some organization to it? It's not perfect, but how do we start to break it down and think about the parts of it? And I want to be clear that this is both a tool for planning, like as a teacher, but then also a tool that you can bring to students as learners in the classroom. And then part of that are tools for constructing visualization. So actually building models of how do we think about the Earth system and how do we visualize and see all of those connections that we know about and care about, and then again, that we can build as we learn more about the world that we love and start to understand how it's all so interconnected and related. And there are also, there's an explicit resource that we developed for supporting the design of coherent instructional units. Okay, if it's complex and there are all these different parts, like how do you weave the pieces together? How do you create that coherency across like a unit or even across multiple units of study in a classroom? And so we've developed a resource that can help teachers with that process. And I've come back to this meme over and over and over again because I feel like it so perfectly captures like what we're trying to do. Like we often teach um, topics in science classes. Historically, it's the way I was taught. It's the way I taught for many years. We teach it as discrete bits of information. Here are the pieces you need to know. But the reality is what we want is for our students to be thinking about the connections between the dots. What are the big ideas and why are they important and how are they related to each other? Because very often in a lot of the districts that I work in, climate change is a single unit. It's like, well, we're going to do the climate change unit. And a lot of my focus is really on let's move away from that model. Let's talk about every unit and how it's connected to climate change or how it supports our understanding of climate change or the effects of climate change or the solutions to climate change. How do we interweave climate change with everything that we're teaching because we know that it's related? And I just want to call out that I've had some amazing partners in this work, including HHMI Bio Interactive, over the years, National Geographic, Miller and Living Biology, which is one of the biggest textbooks that's used in the country. And so again, and of course, CLEAN, the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, which I'm very grateful for all their feedback and support for understanding global change and its use in classrooms. Because when I came to this environment, obviously, like, because I guess UGC started being developed about 7 or 8 years ago, and in the form that you see it in now. And there were a lot of already amazing resources at the table, right? A lot of already great principles and ocean literacy principles, et cetera. But what I really wanted to do was also be able to find a way to weave all of those pieces together and like, how do you create that coherence again? And how do you also be responsive to next generation science standards? Because around that time, NGSS was really taking off. And we really wanted to make sure that we could really hit on all three dimensions, including those science and engineering practices and those cross-cutting concepts. Because again, we know that things like modeling and thinking about feedbacks and interrelationships are part of what the NGSS standards expect us to do with our learners in the classroom, is to help them think about the world in this way. So here's a 5th grade standard, which I work a lot on with teachers about how do we address this standard? How do we address this performance expectation? Develop a model using an example to describe ways the geosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere interact. Or a high school standard about analyzing geoscience data and looking at feedbacks, right? And making claims about how different parts of the Earth system are related to each other. So again, this is where a lot of these resources came from, was also in response to what the NGSS was asking us to do, and realizing that there wasn't any one tool that helped us address some of these bigger ideas and weave it all together. Okay, so let's keep going and keep stretching our brains a little bit. So just take 20 seconds on your own paper. Just think about, why is thinking about systems useful? So you saw that in this standard, right, there's a cross-cutting concept about systems and system models, like that students are expected to be using systems and system models. So why might that be useful? Why is thinking about systems useful? And how do we know if our students are using systems thinking? So just take 20 seconds for yourself and write down some ideas. And feel free to use diagrams or words, whatever works best for you. Okay, so now I want to spend a few minutes, and I actually want to make that thinking visible, and I want us to all put it in the same space. So I'm going to put a link to, it's a tiny URL in the chat. Hopefully, yep, that worked. Let me know if you have any trouble getting into that slide deck. But on slide 1, which I'll show you in a second, there's some space with those 2 questions laid out, like you see here now. And you can grab one of these sticky notes that's around the edge, or if you want to, you could also draw or import an image if you know how to do that in slides, if that's useful. I also want to call out that there's this tool called the Scribble tool that you can select if you want to draw something. Oop, that didn't work. So yeah, just know there are different ways, but easiest thing to do is probably just grab one of these sticky notes, and you can adjust the size and move it around wherever you want to put it to answer one or both of these questions. Oh, I love some of these comments about how like people actually experience the world as a system. So like, why would we teach it any other way? Um, that's awesome. And yeah, that we're part of a system. Whatever happens to it affects us. And thanks for reformatting your stickies. I know this is kind of an awkward way of doing it. And many concepts are intersectional. This is awesome. All right, keep the ideas coming. I see a lot of people typing. And so how do we know if our students are using systems thinking? Maybe students are making connections through written, verbal, or visual communications. That's awesome. And if they can explain the model, yeah, not just repeat it or parrot back, yeah, repeat the information. Very cool. Students making connections across subjects and lessons. Making connections to prior knowledge and lived experiences. Wonderful. Yeah, because of students' actions and behaviors or the work that they do. Having students make personal connections. Again, someone talking about personal connections. It's great. Yeah, and that it's useful again because it helps students connect bits of information and deepen their understanding. And also really, understand more complex socioscientific issues, right? Because socioscientific issues usually require thinking about the system that we live in. All right. Any last thoughts that we want to just record here? These are great. Thank you for your participation and all of your ideas. Yeah, so making all these connections, super important. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my slides. All right, so when I ask teachers to do this in person, not surprisingly, they do a lot of drawing, talking about what systems are and showing like why they're important and how we can, understand how things work together and nothing is in isolation, and also trying to figure out how the world is organized. And of course, NGSS gives us its own definition of systems and of a system. That a system is an organized group of related objects or components, and models can be useful for understanding and predicting the behavior of systems. So that's why we use modeling in combination with systems. And I saw that some of you talked about that students can make models as part of their understanding and showing what they're thinking. And of course, that the NGSS shows us that at different grade levels, we're hoping that students can use systems and systems thinking in different ways at different levels, right? So they can be thinking about the inputs and the outputs. And again, using systems to define boundaries and understand conditions and changes over time by the time they're in high school, which is really great. And what's wonderful is, again, that we know that having systems thinking can really support a pro-environmental worldview, which can also support our understanding and our need for action in response to climate change. So this is research that came out of the Yale Climate Change Communication Group a number of years ago. But again, showing that at least in adult learners, there's this very clear connection between what systems thinking can do in sort of helping us understand and respond to climate change and recognize the urgency of that work. And just one other paper I want to point out is some research, I think actually out of the Netherlands, highlighting the fact that if we are explicit about using systems language, which some of you are already using, talking about components and interactions and inputs and outputs and feedbacks and dynamics, right, that these are actually really useful ways to make sure that students are sort of always looking for systems and they're thinking with a systems framework in the way they are working and thinking. So again, being aware of these systems characteristics and these system words that we can be using and applying to lots of different contexts can be really useful in the way that we teach about systems. And so again, you'll get this slide deck, and if you want to access these papers or for some reason you can't find them, let me know and I can email them to you because I think these are really great resources. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is to build these connections, right? We want our students to be thinking in an interdisciplinary way. We're dealing with climate change, which is a very complex phenomenon and a series of changes which require systems thinking. And so in response, we built the Understanding Global Change framework and resources to really support that kind of thinking about making these connections and using models as a tool for showing what you know and what you understand, and also what you're wondering. So the Understanding Global Change tools were really designed to help you discover why the climate and environment is changing, your place in the system, and also paths to a resilient future. Because all of these things, of course, are interrelated, how we live now and the decisions that have been made in the past, but then also the decisions that we need to make moving forward, so that we can live in a more resilient way. And of course, really be able to understand and visualize how everything is interconnected. All these different processes and phenomena related to climate and ecosystem change are related and connected. So this is the homepage of the Understanding Global Change website, where all of these resources live, and they're free to download and use in lots and lots of ways. I always recommend grounding yourself in the how to use this website slideshow in case you're new to the website. And the first thing that will be introduced to you on that introduction to that website is this Earth scene. Which is one of the tools that we developed. And what I did was actually piece together lots of different parts of like textbook graphics and visuals, and we remade a graphic to really represent lots of different parts of the world. And this becomes a place where we can create models to show how different parts of the world are interconnected. You might notice that it's kind of a squished world, right? Like we have things like penguins and ice over here, just across this little ocean, right? Where we have a coastline and a farm and a city. But the idea is that it still just gives students a place to put their ideas and show relationships between things that might be happening in the ocean or in the geosphere or in the atmosphere. And representing a lot of the different processes that might be happening on Earth across the world at different latitudes and in different places, of course. But very often we ask students, like, what parts of the world do you notice on this scene? What's represented here? And maybe ask them even why we would squish the world in this way to help you maybe sort out some of your ideas. But this has become a really useful tool that teachers use. What we do is we work with a printing company in California, and we laminate these, and these become reusable templates for, again, students to write their ideas and show their thinking. And if you have interest in getting some of these for your classroom, I have teachers who've used the same ones for like 8 years now because they're very resilient, and you can use dry erase markers on them. So if this is something that might be useful for you for thinking about models, that's one of the tools that we built. But then on top of this, we've also developed the Understanding Global Change framework. So here's the template where you can show all of your different ideas, right? And the complexity of the world and start to draw them out. But then we also want to provide some organization for all of the big pieces of the world. And like, what are those pieces that we really need to be paying attention to, and why do they matter? And the way that we've organized our framework is into 3 sections. That there's the Earth system. There are these big processes that have shaped the world through time for millions, if not billions of years. Things like the water cycle, or the greenhouse effect, or the rock cycle, or the carbon cycle, right? These are really big Earth system processes that have been going on for a very long time. But the way that those processes are operating can affect what we're measuring in the system. So if the carbon cycle is changing, or if the water cycle is changing, we can be thinking about things like temperature or biodiversity or ocean acidification, right? These are things that we measure and monitor through time in the world. And that word measurable is really intentional because we really want it to reflect that idea of like, there's data and evidence, right? We're going out into the world and we can understand how much and how fast the world is changing through time. And then finally, that there are causes of change, so that there are ultimate things that both humans and also non-human processes that happen that can really be causes for changes in the system that result in the measurable changes that we're experiencing. So I'll talk a little bit more about what those measurable changes are, but of course, in the last 200 years, we really have to look to humans to explain the rate and magnitude of the changes that we experience on Earth. So we represent that organization in terms of these concentric circles, which of course are, again, meant to represent the different parts of the world. That we have these causes of change that put pressure on our Earth system that can change the rate and magnitude of how the world is working, like the carbon cycle and the water cycle. And then we can measure certain things within the Earth system, right? Like ocean acidification or precipitation or temperature. And we've also divided up that world into the 4 spheres: atmosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, and geosphere. We assume that the cryosphere is part of the hydrosphere in this model, just so you know, in case you're looking for the cryosphere, which I would understand because it's very important. And all the slides I'm about to show you also live within this section of our website called Understanding Global Change 101, which is under our What is Global Change tab. And so you can freely download and use these slides and rearrange them in any way that you need to. Just want to show you that those are available. And I want to stress that the introduction I'm about to give you to the full framework and all of the detail is really for adult learners or upper high school level, that there are many ways to introduce the framework for planning and during instruction, and that teachers indicate that also just using this as a planning tool or just leaving it out on their desks often forces them to start thinking in a systems way when they're planning. So again, think of not just as a tool for your students, but also a tool for you for your own planning and thinking. And the reality is that if they're going to use the framework in any way during instruction, whether you're talking about third graders or you're talking about high schoolers or you're talking about undergraduate students, learners need opportunities like use the framework more than once. This isn't kind of a one and done resource. It's a kind of resource. The idea is to come back to it, to reflect on it, to use it and build it up over time, how you're using it and how you're thinking about it. It's a way, again, of organizing and bringing all these really big ideas together about climate and global change broadly. Okay, so now I'm going to give you, again, sort of the adult learner or upper high school or beyond introduction to the Understanding Global Change framework. So we'll start with this what we call the simple framework. So this is the basic organization of our framework. And the first thing I want to dive into is that Earth system and how the Earth system works. So again, we have our four spheres, but what we really need to think about first is where does the energy come from that drives the processes in those four spheres? And our main sources of energy, of course, are from the sun, how much sunlight is absorbed or reflected, either from the surface of the Earth or in our atmosphere, and also how much heat is being re-radiated, again, from the surface or in our atmosphere. And then, of course, we have Earth's internal heat from the formation of the Earth and radioactive decay, which drives a lot of the processes in our geosphere. But this is our global energy budget that drives the processes that shape our world all around us all the time. And on the Understanding Global Change website, we have actually a page for each of these concepts that we call out. We also call these the icons because these are the pieces of the framework. So each icon has its own web page where you can learn more, and there's data and graphics and links to be thinking about what do we mean by absorption of sunlight, or what do we mean by re-radiation of heat, if you want to learn more about the global energy budget, for example. So let's keep filling out this framework, this circle. So if we look to our atmosphere and our hydrosphere, the really fundamental processes that shape the way the world works and the way it looks all the time for much of Earth history, right, have been the greenhouse effect, and then our atmosphere and ocean circulation, which we know are very related, and then the water cycle, how water cycles through the system. And again, we have lots of supporting graphics on our website and information, background information about these concepts. And if we turn to our biosphere and our geosphere, we can talk about things like evolution and species interactions. We have an entire website at UCMP just on evolution, so we know that's a huge concept, but again, it's a process that shapes the world, right? It's a really big, important process, and that's why it's in this ring of how the Earth system works. And then we have photosynthesis and respiration, which of course are a product of evolution, but they are so important in the biosphere and how it shapes our world that we needed to call them out here. And then within our geosphere, we have processes like the rock cycle and plate tectonics, which is of course part of the rock cycle. And we also called out weathering because it's a very important part of how the long-term carbon cycle works and how much CO2 we have in our atmosphere through chemical reactions of weathering. So just wanted to call that out explicitly. That's really important, again, for understanding long-term climate change over millions of years, is how much rock is weathering on Earth, which is really interesting. And so go to that page if you want to learn more. And then we can, of course, connect all the spheres with the elemental cycles. So things like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Phosphorus doesn't go into the atmosphere, but carbon and nitrogen, of course, do. And again, we can connect all the different parts of the world with these elemental cycles. Okay, so I know that was a lot, but if you add up all of those really big processes, again, thinking about the carbon cycle and photosynthesis and the greenhouse effects and the rock cycle and the water cycle, these are the fundamental processes that shape our climate and our ecosystems. If you had, and this was developed with a team of scientists and educators, if you had to press scientists to say, what are those really fundamental big processes that shape the world? This is them. This is that list, right? And again, you see a lot of words and phrases and ideas that are part of the core K-12 curriculum from really young ages, right? In elementary school, we start teaching things like the carbon cycle and the water cycle. So again, these are the really fundamental parts of the world that we want learners to understand and think about how they're related and how we're related to how these processes operate. Okay. So now we want to think about what are the causes of change that we might experience on our planet. So we have the way the world works, these big processes, these systems, right, that shape the world through time. But what are the causes, both human and non-human, that shape the world through time? So I'm going to start with the non-human causes because these are really interesting. So either these are very, very slow processes. So things like the building of mountains and the distribution of continents and oceans, which of course are part of the rock cycle and plate tectonics, but these are the big changes that can cause global changes and big system changes. But these are very, very slow processes. Things like volcanism can be very, very fast. But they're rare, and we're not having volcanism at a rate that would explain the rate of change that we're experiencing today, right? There's no way that volcanoes have contributed to climate change in the same way that humans have. Other things like changes in solar radiation and Earth's spin, tilt, and orbit, we have 11-year solar cycles. We have increases in did anyone see the aurora? It was so amazing. I don't know if anyone was able to see it on this call, but that was pretty amazing. So again, we have these increases and decreases in solar radiation over time, but that can't explain the amount of warming that we're having on Earth right now. And changes in Earth's spin, tilt, and orbit, the orientation of the Earth in space to affect how much sunlight different parts of the Earth are getting. These changes happen on the order of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. So again, not on the human timescales that we're experiencing change. And of course, meteorite impacts, luckily, those are really rare, like the big ones that are very catastrophic and can change our ecosystems. So again, we need to acknowledge that these non-human causes are always around and can cause change, but not at the rate and magnitude that explain what we are experiencing on Earth. But we always want them to be, again, part of the discussion. And again, it's part of what people who say climate change isn't happening or it's a natural part of the system often turn to as explanations. But we know that the rate and magnitude of those changes does not explain climate change today. And again, if you want to go to our website, we'll explain more about what do we mean by Earth's spin, tilt, and orbit. Or what do we mean by 11-year solar sunspot cycles? So again, you can see the amount of energy reaching the top of our atmosphere going up and down, and the overall global surface temperature increasing on Earth despite this up and down of the Earth's or the sun's energy reaching the Earth. So to explain the rate and magnitude of this warming and the changes that we're experiencing today, we have to turn to human causes of change. What are things that humans are doing to rapidly change the world that we live in? And I just want to point out that this is a holistic list. It's not all bad. It's also things that can be constructive and lead to resilience. So for example, we have burning of fossil fuels, but we also have renewable energy. We have deforestation. We also have reforestation. We have habitat loss. We also have restoration. I'm actually working on new versions of the framework, and I'm really thinking of moving away from the color red because I think the color red sends a very specific message sometimes about something being bad. And I don't want us to think about all human activities as being destructive because we know that other possibilities and pathways are possible. And so again, even in the language that we use here, like fishing and hunting, we don't say overfishing and hunting, we just say fishing and hunting. But we know that certain practices in the way that we fish and hunt can be destructive to ecosystems. So we want this to be a more holistic view of human causes of change, both good and bad from the human or the ecosystem perspective. And again, if you want to learn more about all of these topics, we have pages about each of them on our website. So these are the ones that are focused on resource extraction and use, but then also mitigation and adaptation to global change and climate change, and all of what that could mean and what that looks like, and the activities that are already happening across the globe. Okay. And then the final part of this framework is the heart of it, which are those measurable changes. And as I mentioned, the measurable changes, that, you know, that word measurable is very intentional, because the purpose is that these are things that we can, again, monitor and measure through time. This is our data. This is our evidence. How do we know the world is changing and how much it's changing? And if you're looking to do phenomena-based learning, these measurable changes are the foundation for phenomena, things that are observable, things that are measurable. And again, phenomena-based learning is really a part of the next generation science standards and a lot of the inquiry-based work that we want students to be able to do, and the way that they're thinking about the world. And so sometimes as a teacher, as an educator, it really helps to look at these measurable changes to think about what are the phenomena, what are the measurable changes that I want my students to understand, how and why they're happening, and also then what can we do about them, or what are we already doing about them, and what are the actions we can take. So for example, if we look at the measurable changes in the atmosphere and the hydrosphere, we have things like we can measure greenhouse gases, right? We can measure airborne particles. On a daily, hourly basis, we measure weather over 30 years or long periods of time or more. We call that climate, but we measure extreme events, and we measure things like wind and clouds and precipitation and temperature. In our hydrosphere, we can do things like measure ocean acidification or measure sea level rise, right? Just measure snow and ice cover, these changes in our hydrosphere. And again, we have resources on the website that can introduce you to these concepts and help you learn more about things like changes in greenhouse gases over time, changes in global surface temperatures, changes in Arctic sea ice. Again, a lot of changes that we're seeing. And then that we're measuring, and that scientists all over the world are working to understand. And if we turn to our biosphere, thinking about things like species populations, species ranges, where they live, extinction, biodiversity, soil quality, which of course is huge. We were talking about food systems earlier. And then other processes in the geosphere, like sedimentation and erosion and uplift of land and nutrients, the nutrients that are present in our hydrosphere and geosphere. So you'll notice we have some things that, of course, overlap in boundaries between the spheres, right, to represent that they are part of both. Wildfires, the atmosphere is obviously affected and part of combustion, but also what burns is the biosphere. What burns is life and plant material. So we wanted to acknowledge that in the way that we construct this. And then if you look at the very heart of our framework are the parts of the world that most directly affect the quality of human life. We are a cause of change, and we also deal with the consequences of change. And so our air, our food, our water, where we can live, our health, all these things that you mentioned earlier in the chat, these affect our well-being, and also, of course, the well-being of the planet overall. And I really think it shouldn't just be human life, this is all life. And again, we're working on some updates and changes to this. But again, this is really a way of thinking about the things that are also most connected to justice, climate justice, social justice, how we have access to the resources that we need for the quality of life that we have and our well-being. So look to the heart of the framework to look for those justice connections, because we have a lot of decisions to make about the future that we want on our planet and what that's going to look like. So this is the full framework. And again, I know this is a lot. Again, I want to stress again that this introduction I just gave you in like 10 minutes was for adult learners. But this introduces you to this as a tool that you can use for planning and thinking about the work that you do. And I want to stress that one of the ways that we use this, like for example, if we're teaching about sea level rise, we can use this framework and build it up slowly over time with our students. We don't introduce all of the icons all at once, but maybe we first just want to talk about what are the causes of change that we want to call attention to. If we're learning about sea level rise, we have to talk about burning of fossil fuels, and we want to talk about mitigation. We want to talk about renewable energy. Sea level rise, we'd want to talk about the greenhouse effect and how heat and energy are in our system are relating to the water cycle, and that's directly related to sea level rise. And then, of course, measuring greenhouse gases and temperature and water temperature, students' understanding. So again, this is sort of the word wall example of how to use the framework with students. And again, I have a lot of teachers who are using and exploring how to use it in this way. I'll point out on the website that if you want to just navigate around the framework, there's a clickable version, which is really fun under Understanding Global Change Framework. So on this page, let's say, for example, I want to learn more about burning of fossil fuels. I can click on that part of the framework and it'll take me to the web page. And then all of the other topics that are on the framework are also hyperlinked. So for example, if I want to learn more about also air temperature, I can click on that hyperlink and it'll take me to the temperature page, which is some more data and information and resources to think about that part of the world and that measurable change in the system. There are just lots of other ways to navigate this content, which I'll just point out really quickly. We have these lists of the content pages divided into by the 3 categories, of course, in our framework. And so if you go to a measurable changes section, you can also then sort it by like, I'm really looking for phenomena, I'm really looking for connections that I want to make in the biosphere. So you could click on biosphere and then it will sort all of these topics by just the biosphere topics as a way of just navigating the content. Okay. And then there's a version that we call the everyday language version, which I'll just call out to you, which is, again, freely available to download on the website. And it uses more accessible language. So again, instead of saying things like ocean circulation, it says things like movement of ocean water, just using a few more words to make it more accessible to learners really of all ages. I often use this with students all the way through high school. We don't necessarily have to use what we call like the full version or the complex version, but the everyday language version is really great for supporting this thinking. And all of the resources that you see are both in Spanish and, funny enough, in Danish, because we have a colleague at the Danish Geographical Society who really is using these resources in their work. And so they were able to help us get all of that translated. But all of these graphics are downloadable of different sizes, and also in black and white and in color, depending on what you have access to create copies. And again, here's these really, the very simple frameworks. And again, that example of how you could be using this just as a word wall, right? You don't have to build it all up at once, but you could be adding the icons, the different pieces of it as you go, as students learn about different parts. Because our ultimate goal is that students really develop and articulate a systems perspective, right? Understanding how all these pieces are connected and shape the world that we live in. And so I've had teachers say to me over time, like, basically the UGC framework is like a mini textbook, or it's the You Are Here map. It's like, what am I teaching today? And what am I teaching tomorrow? And how are they connected? And starting to visualize that. And so if you're teaching photosynthesis, which is obviously usually a part of like a lot of K-12 curriculum, and I work with a lot of bio teachers, right? Or if you're teaching about species interactions, what are the relationships to other climate change and global change topics that you can make? And how do you actually draw those out? How do you articulate those? And how do you connect them? And so again, using this as the You Are Here map can be really helpful. And I want to give you some time now to use the You Are Here map and just start playing around with it. So if you go to slides 3 to 32 on that same deck that we were on before, the same link, you'll see a slide where you can add your name, and then you can also start drawing on the framework and also just start zooming in and out or using circles to call things out. But what are the things that you teach? Just start circling the things that you recognize that you know you already teach. And if you can, think about how they're connected, or think about how those things are connected also to the quality of human life, again, the heart of that framework. And I just want to point out that, again, we have this scribble tool that you can use on slides to just draw lines with your mouse, with your cursor. Sometimes you have to really just like hold it down to get it to work. So just let me know if you're having any trouble with that. But also feel free to use like the shapes file if you just want to like make circles to call them out. But this can be a really useful exercise to just start recognizing what are the things that I teach and how are they placed on this framework. And I also just want to call out that you can zoom in. You can actually type in a number here if you want to do it like by 500 times, and that'll make it much easier to read if you want to zoom in and out on the framework. But But these slides are available again for you to use however you want. But let's just take a few minutes now and you can do that. And I'll switch back to the slide deck. See your names going in. That's awesome. Oh yeah, here's the link. There you go. Sorry about that. I should have reposted it. So yeah, let's just take a few minutes and oh, I see some people making circles. That's awesome. We're using stars. I love it. Yeah, just call out what are those things I know I already teach? What does that look like?
Now, are we on slide 3? Is that where we're at?
So you can pick a slide and put your name on it, any slide between slide 3 and slide 32, I think. So there are lots of extra slides. So you can just pick one and put your name on it and make it yours.
Okay.
Yeah. And let me know if there are any other questions. And in just a couple minutes, we'll come back to the slide deck. But yeah, let me know if are there any other questions that you'd like to ask at this time. I'm happy to answer them about what you're thinking or what you're seeing on the framework. Okay, I see people calling things out. I also see a lot of people who are circling things in like all three, like the blue, yellow, and red, which is awesome. Again, making those connections across the different parts of the framework, which is really exciting.
Where was the percent? Make it bigger.
Oh, it's up in the corner here. So you can type in like 500.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Got it.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I know we just have a few more minutes. I want to keep you on time. So I just want to kind of share with you some of the last thoughts that I have about how we use this, and then I'll be able to take any other questions that you're thinking about. Um, so again, we use the framework as a planning tool. It's really a way to think about like how am I going to make connections across different parts of the system and how I teach it, and also starting to think about the order in which you teach it and the connections that you're hoping students will make. Because again, we want to move away from this idea of teaching discrete bits of information to really building knowledge. and showing those connections between these big ideas. And so what we do is we then take those pieces of the framework and turn them into, again, what we call the icon cards, which are, again, freely available to download. We also have digital tools where students can make their own models and use that Earth scene template to show the connections that they're thinking about and write explanations of how different parts of the world are connected, how they know that, what's their evidence, what's the learning that they've done to show that those different pieces are related. And so again, all of the icon sets are available on the website to download and use, both English and Spanish and Danish. And then the Earth scene in both color and black and white can be downloaded. Actually a picture of my colleague Jen Pierce from many years ago, and she's used this in a lot of really fun interactive ways as well in a classroom. So this is showing young students who are drawing on the wall to write their connections about the greenhouse effect. So she's projecting onto a whiteboard using some of the digital tools and slides. And on our website, we have this whole section that's called Construct a Model, where it's a drag and drop application where you can make models of all different kinds and complexities, and you can annotate them. You can export this as a PowerPoint. It's a really wonderful tool. We're also very fortunate that it's been selected for the Clean Collection, which is exciting. So it's undergone the Clean review. And what's great is you can make these models and build them up over time. So for example, this is a model about ocean acidification, showing connections between land to air to water, and how ocean acidification is affecting life cycles and traits and species ranges and a lot of the biosphere in the ocean. And again, this is related to a lot of the work that I'm doing, but that of course also we have the greenhouse effect and global warming, which is warming our oceans. And so we're studying this double whammy of acidification and ocean warming. But we have a model now where we can show those connections and explain that and use the pieces of the framework. And each of these numbers can be an explanation for how we know that and why we know that. So you can make all different types of fill in the blank things, activities using this interactive. And their ideas and annotations into the interactive tool. We have examples of models also on our website, especially on the Earth system pages. And again, all of the teaching materials are free to download in our teaching resources. And if you want to get more ideas for how to use the materials, one of the really fun games that we've started to play is also called Earth System Bingo, where we show students a graph or a video or some sort of data set, and we ask them to figure out which Earth system parts of your system are connected to what you're looking at. And so these are actually some Earth System Bingo games where we were analyzing otter videos of river otters that were living in local ecosystems and connecting it back to a lot of the ecosystem and climate changes that are happening in the San Francisco Bay Area. So you'll see things like tail and otters and gull. And so again, but this is one way to also use the icons and sort of make it into a game where students are having to articulate and see connections between different things and different ideas. One last thing I'll call out is just that we've developed some example units. This is one of them. There are others that are on our website now that were developed by teachers. But what we did was we actually used a collection of clean resources and used them together in concert to create an entire sea level rise unit that's built around the use of the Understanding Global Change tools. And like this is the model that students build by the end, or an example of what the model might look like of the main connections to relate back to understanding sea level rise and how and why it's happening. And there are lots of tools for planning, again, on the website that were co-developed with an amazing group of teachers. We do a lot of professional learning around these tools. And a lot of the work that we're actually moving into now is relating to history and social science education as well as science education. So we have some new PLC and workshops that will be offered next school year around those topics. And feel free to reach out if you're interested in some of that interdisciplinary work and research that we're doing. We don't have time to play Earth System Shuffle today, but I will share the slides with you. It's a really fun game where you can construct models and move around different parts of the Earth system. And again, so these are some examples of what models can look like when you're making them digitally online and working in teams to construct models and write explanations about how different parts of the world are connected and show those relationships. And I'm just so grateful for all of the support that I've had from Clean and educators across the country in the development and use of these tools. And please feel free to reach out. I just want to also thank my team. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions if we have like a minute. But thank you again for having me. And sorry, I always overplan for these things. And I feel like an hour and a half is usually the minimum amount of time I really need. But thank you for having me. And I hope this was at least a useful brief introduction to the resources.
That was actually very good timing. Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, let's spend just like a minute or two on questions. If anyone has any, although I didn't see any in the chat, so I think that you were answering them as you go along, or as you went along, I mean. And there are, as Jessica mentioned, there are some, there's plenty of resources online to access this, and I will send out a lot of this information in a post email to you all. So, you know, you will have access to that and feel free to explore at your own leisure. Looks like maybe all of the questions were answered in the presentation. So, yeah. Oh, Emily has her hand up.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Emily.
This isn't a question about the resource necessarily. I think you answered all my questions for that. It's really cool. I think I might have peripherally used some of this before, but I haven't actually gone to that website. So now I will do that and make better use of it. But my question was more about your research. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, like how anxious are you about phytoplankton being affected by ocean acidification?
Oh, I'm pretty anxious about like a lot of ecosystems being affected by both acidification and warming. Again, I think it's a double whammy that we're dealing with. So, yeah, I mean, I would say like like an 8 or a 9 or a 10. I'm at a yeah. And part of it is too, I've actually been doing a lot of work with partners who are studying salmonids in the Pacific and really understanding how dietary changes due to warming are now affecting fish populations and nutrient availability. So there are so many like changes that we're seeing that trickle down through the system. So it's about those primary producers, but then it also, we really see it in those large fish as well that are foundational in both our terrestrial and our marine ecosystems. Yeah, one of the things I've been working on recently is related to salmonid populations in California. It's a good and important question. And again, thinking about all those connections that we can make.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you. Phytoplankton is not sometimes a word my college students have heard before. So, or, you know, the importance of the ocean and natural necessarily been stressed. So,
Yeah, and of course that even it's a source of most of our oxygen, which we don't talk about. So yeah, yeah, all the ways in which we need that for food webs and oxygen and yeah, and the future. So yeah, thanks, Emily. Thanks for bringing that up. I see some questions in the chat. Yes, you can use the UGC framework and for lectures and presentations, please do. Please use these slides. Please use the ones that you can download off the website. Yeah, and we would just love for you to acknowledge where they came from when appropriate, but we want them to get out there. And so please use the materials as you need to for your work in your, and thank you for all of what you do on the ground every day is so important as we support our young learners in navigating a changing world and a lot of important decisions and work that we need to do. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks for spending a whole hour with us this morning and for sharing all of these awesome resources with us. Jessica's a really great partner with Clean, and we're just very grateful to have her here. So thank you again.
Thanks, Gina. I'm grateful for you and Alicia too, and Clean, and just, yeah, wonderful community. So again, please reach out. I'm always interested in hearing from teachers who are interested in either using or have tried out the materials, and also just, again, as I mentioned, other PLC opportunities for really sort of sustained contact and learning and discussions. And we're starting some new programs that are really interdisciplinary now, which is very exciting. So thank you. Thank you. Okay. I know you need to take a
Thanks so
break
much.
or you need to move on to the next thing, so I don't want to keep you, but please be in touch.
Bye, Jessica.
Thanks, Jessica.
Bye.
Okay. Nice to see all of you. I've just been kind of off in the background. My name is Alicia. I work for Series like Gina does and Support Clean. And I have been supporting Clean a lot actually around kind of both kind of resources for elementary teachers and also resources for kind of helping students deal with climate emotions. So I'll be talking a little bit more about the climate emotions piece this afternoon. But right now we're gonna, I'm gonna give you some background on some different kind of lessons that you could run with students in terms of getting them outside and doing some field experiences around climate change. So let me share my screen here. Find the right one. There it is. Okay. Okay. My background is actually in a lot of informal science education, and so a lot of the education that I've done has been outdoors, in getting students really engaged with outdoors um, and exploring their environment, learning to love bugs instead of be fearful of them, installing, really love for insects and bugs at an early age, not only helps engage students, in the environments that surround them, whether that be, a natural park or potentially they're in a bunch of apartment buildings with only black tops, they can still always find bugs, which are a part of nature. And in term and getting them to play out in nature more, getting them to start to think about the needs of animals in nature. What do those bugs need in terms of a home? And I have seen a group of students who were terrified of bugs, just completely terrified, change in just, one classroom setting of playing with nature and starting to empathize and build homes and stuff for the bugs, to then catching bumblebees with their nets and, putting them in jars. And, this was a group that at the beginning, like everybody got up and ran away when a when a bumblebee came in. So I think these outdoor field experiences can be really, really powerful in terms of getting students to care more for their environments. And, especially if you're starting with students from a young age, just getting them to play outdoors and notice things, and start to care for, the things that they're seeing out there, will do a lot towards, as they get older, really appreciating and loving nature and wanting to help protect it and feel and more empowered to actually come up with climate solutions. So that's why we have this kind of activity in here. And so this activity that we're going to embark on is kind of a combination of a couple activities. One is this link here, the climategeneration.org, that Gina will put in the chat. And this kind of takes you through, how to run an outdoor field experience with your students. I think if you go to Climate Generation, you have to order it. Basically, it's free. You just have to order it in your cart, and then you'll be able to download it if you want to see the full lesson plan as we're kind of going through this. this workflow is also, I'm combining some other techniques that I've used and been using recently that are part of another program that I have been involved with called Heart Force, and in something called town watching. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those things in a second. But what I, let me just, okay. So we've already talked about kind of like why these field experiences can be so important for students. Not only are they important for the reasons that I just talked about, but it also makes they can be really interdisciplinary applications to classroom learning. I think you can get students outdoors and connecting it to fields or connecting it to concepts in a variety of fields, including social studies and English and the sciences, even history, in terms of just having students think about what that environment may have looked like, hundreds of years ago. Also, these field experiences make learning very place-based uh, and help students make very local connections through direct observation. That's especially important in the elementary years, but also very important in the middle and high school years too. Sometimes we have a tendency to share things that are happening outside of our own regions and our own states. But really these local experiences are the ones that are going to have the most memorable impacts for students. It also helps students start to see their communities and their schools as places of climate solutions. And it's just more memorable too because it's active and outdoors. And for you too, I think these field experiences have a lot of benefits. They allow you to connect to the nearby places and take time to slow down and recharge, which I am guessing all of you need. I know I need it. um, and start to think about, how you are connected to climate change solutions. So we're gonna just briefly kind of do an introduction to this field experience here. I know we're running a little bit late, and just to kind of start getting you to think about different prompts that you're going to explore when you're out and about. You'll have lunchtime from noon to 1 then, or we might extend that a little bit based on when we get done here, to go out into your community and collect data and also eat some lunch. Maybe you can even eat your lunch outside. And then we'll come back together after lunch and kind of do a debrief. So this activity is interdisciplinary and includes skills related to scientific observation, data collection in the form of photography and audio recordings. You could ask students to collect other types of data in science classes or in your classes if you wish, such as weather observations, for example, or observations, of the animals that they're seeing and what they're doing. Also involves creative writing and poetry, and also gives them kind of more of a geospatial awareness, as this activity will involve finding their location on a map as well. So real quick, just paste in the chat. What do you think of when you hear climate change? Like, what is the first thing that pops up into your brain? Warming. A lot of people global warming. A globe. You don't want to know. Okay. Um, change in the weather long term, flooding, doom, extreme weather. Yeah, so many of these are about the impacts, right? I'm not sure what the you don't want to know is about, but I have a feeling that's maybe not a positive a positive comment. Graphs upon graphs. Yeah. Um, and and so I ask this because I think these field experiences hopefully can start to change students minds about just focusing on the impacts of climate change. So many of you talked, notice some of these like extreme weather and natural hazards, fire, floods, drought. There's just so many messages in the media. Matt talked a little bit about this morning that a lot of the messages in the media are just all about the doom and the gloom. Yeah, anxiety and depression. It brings up a lot of just uh, upsetting feelings, right? Uh, which is why, one way of helping students and yourselves deal with some of these distressing um, emotions, is to start to have students think about solutions and spend less time on talking about the impacts and more time talking about the solutions. And I want to kind of put a caveat in here that I think when we are engaging students in coming up with solutions, I think it's also really important for us to put the message out there uh, that solving the climate crisis is not solely up to them. I think sometimes we forget to say that. We get so, into like trying to help students come up with all these solutions that they start to feel that, oh my gosh, this is up to them and their generation. And I think it's important, before kind of starting to talk about these solutions, that you're talking with students about there are, millions of people working on the climate crisis, and showing examples of some of the things that these people are doing and saying, it's not all up to you. And, we're sorry that, things are the way that they are. And, when that we know our generation, uh, definitely contributed to where we are currently at. Um, so, so in thinking then about climate change solutions, when you look at this picture here, what are some different examples that you see of climate change solutions in this picture? Less cars. Yeah, definitely. I don't see one car. Green roofs, lots of green. Yeah. People walking, being encouraged to walk. Yeah, shady places for people to gather. Um, backyard gardening, density, more trees and bushes, rooftop gardening, solar panels. Yeah, it looks like there's probably some solar panels up there and community gardens. Yeah. So one, I think this picture just helps bring people closer to nature in general, which is a great reminder of taking care of nature. Um, I don't see an elevator here. Instead, they have this ramp, so you can get, from one place to another, and it forces you to go actually be outside and go outside to get from the lower floors to the upper floors. I think the yeah in creating and thinking about buildings really with nature in mind, and including solar panels and more shady areas, which also can help than having to use less air conditioning. Yeah, you might notice the passive cooling architecture here. So there's a need for less air conditioning here. Even just having all these plants around helps cool the area a lot in the offices. So there's a lot of examples of solutions, and sometimes climate solutions can be tricky because the problem can feel so big that it can feel kind of out of our realm of control. And for students, I think that can feel even more strongly because they don't feel like they have as much power and control over what is happening in their environment. And so I think the key piece with when you're thinking about solutions with your students is to really have them be focusing on things that are within their control, that are local, that they can impact, that they can make a difference. Those are the things that are really going to, help students be able to kind of deal with and process these tough emotions of anxiety and depression and et cetera, et cetera. So you all kind of looked at that last picture and thought about and noticed there were some solutions that had been put in place. And mostly when we looked at this previous picture, we were looking a lot at solutions that could help mitigate climate change, meaning that these are solutions that could help put less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And hopefully lessen, just the amount of carbon dioxide and pollutants and stuff that are going into the atmosphere. There's also, I think, a part of doing community exploration and field observations that can look also at kind of how can we adapt our communities to be more resilient against climate change and the impacts of climate change. So when you look at these three pictures here, these are all examples of basically one example of something in the community that is not going to make the house or the community more resilient against a natural hazard, and one where it is going to make the community more resilient against a natural hazard. So in this first photo here, we have a dense forest with tons of undergrowth, very susceptible to wildfire. Here, they've cleared away a lot of that fuel, and that makes that forest more resilient against wildfires. Here in this photo, you have a ground that's sloping towards the house. If flooding were occurring in this area, that flooding would cause the water to the house. In terms of thinking about drought, we are in, I know we're all in communities where we see both of these, right? We see greenscaping lawns and native plants. And one uses a lot more water than the other. So I show you some of these photos because as you go out into your communities, I'm going to ask you to just start thinking about and paying attention to what surrounds your community. What solutions do you see that your community has already put into place to either mitigate or adapt to climate change? What areas do you see that maybe need to be more resilient and need to be adapted to better adapt to a changing planet and to some of these natural hazards that may come up? And then, where are there opportunities for solutions also to mitigate, and lessen the amount of carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere? So what you're going to do is you're going to explore a nearby place that you love, or you can also go for what's called a town watch. So town watching is something actually that I think was kind of created by the Japanese. It's now been being used some in Europe. And the idea here is that you go out into your community and you just walk and you look for some of these things that I showed you earlier. You look at places where you see your community is going to be resilient towards natural hazards that climate change is impacting. You look for places community may not be more resilient and opportunities that could make your communities more resilient. Um, so those are kind of your two options. I'll say the first option, I think exploring a nearby place that you love, is probably really appropriate. I mean, it's really appropriate for everyone, especially elementary students, I would say. The town watching is probably something more that you might use with middle or high school or college students. Um, and you're going to make observations of what's happening in your community. And then take some notes using reflection prompts that I'll show in a minute as a guide. Take photos or audio clips and just kind of start to think about how you're feeling as you're noticing these things in your communities. Then I'm going to ask you to um, either write a short poem using your notes and kind of your photos and sounds, or just take your observations and your photos and load them up onto this Padlet map here. And we're going to share this whole slide deck with you, so you'll be able to get in and get these links. Gina has also been putting these links in the chat as well. Oops, sorry, you'll have, an opportunity. Basically, this is a Padlet that Climate Generation uses. So tons of people add to this Padlet to just share kind of their observations about climate change. If you're in there and have time, look at the other posts as well. And then we'll come back together after lunch to kind of debrief some of the observations and things that you notice in your community. So here's some ideas for reflection prompts that you your community smell, taste, sound like. What are you seeing? What are the memories that you have in these places? How, when you think about weather, how has weather been impacting your community? If you've been in your community for a while, what environmental changes have you noticed over the year? These two that I put in blue aren't a part of the Climate Generation's prompt list, but they are a part of this kind of idea of town watching that I talked about, and a part of actually HeartForce curriculum, which is a whole curriculum that Series has developed. The link to the HeartForce curriculum is included in here in the links that Gina added. We have actually a whole town watching lesson that we've put together. We just are still making some final touches on it. It is for middle and high school students to help guide them more in really noticing some of the things that make their communities more resilient towards some of these natural hazards. But just as a way to get you all to start thinking about both solutions to climate change, or both solutions that help mitigate climate change, but also solutions that can help make your communities more resilient to climate change. So yeah, maybe you pick a natural hazard, one that's common to your area, and just start to think about how it might impact your community as you make these observations. And then are there actions that could be taken to make your community more resilient towards the climate impacts? Thinking about then what are actions that you can take and maybe that your students can take as well. So that is the assignment for the next hour. And remember to get hat, sunscreen, all that stuff, water, grab a notebook if you can, your phone, to take pictures. The reflection prompts, I will go back to that in a minute, and you can take a photo, or you can take a picture of all of those if you want, or you can also just use this link to this slide deck to remind yourself of those prompts. There are also our directions in the WOVA documents tab. So, and don't forget to eat lunch. So here's those reflection prompts again. If you want to take a picture of those, screenshot or write them down. And with that, have an enjoyable lunch, getting outside, and we'll see you at 1:15 Mountain Time. Great. I like the hat, Emily.